Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Rowan Ford. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. When she was young, her parents divorced, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella, Missouri. Colleen later met a man named David, and they married. Colleen already had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their marriage, she and David had a daughter together. Rowan has 2 older sisters and 2 older brothers, and they are very close. She enjoys spending time outdoors, biking around town, swimming, and pursuing her passion for painting. She also enjoys attending Sunday school at her local church, where she often volunteers to help children who are having trouble with their homework. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old, she was in 4th grade at her local elementary school. Her mother worked the night shift at a store, while her stepfather was often at the farm during the day. As a result, Rowan was often left to fend for herself, which helped her become very independent. On November 2nd, she was home alone, as usual. Colleen went to work, and her stepfather had not yet returned from the farm. The next morning, around 9 o'clock, Colleen returned home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but her daughter was not there. She asked her husband if he knew where Rowan was, and he told her that Rowan had asked him if she could stay the night at a friend's house. He agreed without asking the friend's name, since their town was small and he wasn't worried about her safety. Colleen felt worried and decided to ask all of Rowan's friends. Since their town only had a few streets, this didn't take long. However, none of Rowan's friends had seen her, and she had not spent the night at any of their homes. This made her mother even more anxious. Colleen searched all over town but could not find her daughter. She finally returned home and told her husband that Rowan was missing. She asked him to contact the police to report the incident, but he assured her that everything was fine and that Rowan would be home soon. After waiting for a few more hours without seeing Rowan, Colleen decided to call 911 and take matters into her own hands. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to Colleen's house to interview David, the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said that he had been working on the farm with his co-worker Christopher that evening when Nathan, a mutual friend of theirs, came to visit. They decided to go to David's house to drink and play pool. They stopped by the store to buy some alcohol before heading to David's house, where they stayed for a few hours. That night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him to a nearby town to pick up car. They convinced David to join them to continue their party. Before leaving the house, Christopher checked to see if Rowan was asleep in her room and found her already asleep. After David left with his friends, they stopped at a store to buy more alcohol and then went to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. David then decided to go home and asked Nathan for a ride. Nathan agreed but chose to take a detour rather than the highway, as he was quite drunk and did not want to get in trouble with the police. Nathan dropped David off and drove home, while David went straight to bed. Shortly after, Rowan woke him up and asked if she could stay the night at a friend's house. Without thinking much of it, he agreed and fell asleep. The police approached the case with suspicion. What puzzled them most was that a 9-year-old girl would decide to go to a friend's house in the middle of the night, especially since her stepfather had not asked about the friend she was visiting. The police chief suspected that David might be hiding something or had something to do with Rowan's disappearance, but there was no evidence to support this suspicion. The police searched the town and the surrounding area until late at night. Locals quickly joined the search because they knew the Rowan family and wanted to help. Stella had a population of only about 150, so news of Rowan's disappearance spread rapidly throughout the area. Locals usually felt safe letting their children play outside, as there was not much going on in such a peaceful place. However, When Rowan disappeared without a trace and the police could not find her throughout the day, the people of Stella became extremely panicked. On the first day of the search, nothing was found. Then, on November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town and spoke to Christopher, who confirmed David's story. However, Christopher added that his friend had not contacted him since that evening, and he had only learned of Rowan's disappearance that same day. The police expanded the search and brought in more volunteers, but they still could not find Rowan or any clues regarding her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation while local police continued to search for Rowan in the area around town. Detectives focused on the possibility of kidnapping. They strongly doubted the David story, as it seemed very suspicious. The police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she had not visited any of them that night. Investigators interviewed David several times, and his testimony varied in detail, further raising suspicions about his involvement. For example, he provided different times for being away that night and even stated that Rowan may not have asked him before going to visit a friend. FBI agents further discovered that on the night of her missing, David had asked his mother to lend him her car, although he had not initially disclosed this to the police. As a result, the police seized both cars for testing, but experts found no evidence. Detectives continued discussions with Christopher and Nathan, as both were with David that night. Christopher was invited to the police station and told the same story as the day before. He also agreed to take a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. A few hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he saw Chief Clark's car. Christopher signaled for Chief Clark to stop. Sheriff Clark is the police chief in the town of Weidner and has known Christopher for 17 years, since Christopher was a child. Clark was a friend of Christopher's adoptive parents, and Christopher had always respected him. He often turned to him for advice or help in times of trouble. Sheriff Clark contacted Christopher, and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. Clark was aware of the case but was not directly involved, as the search was being handled by the Stella Police Department. During their conversation, Clark suspected that Christopher was withholding information, as Rowan's life was in danger and her fate was still uncertain. Therefore, Clark decided to share these suspicions with the FBI, contacting agents to explain his concerns. Investigators suspect that Christopher may be withholding important information about Rowan's disappearance, which could implicate her stepfather. It is possible that he asked Christopher to lie and alter some details in his account of the events of that night. Christopher now fears that he will be considered an accomplice if he tells the truth. Sheriff Clark informed the FBI agents that he had a good and trusting relationship with Christopher, so he wanted to help convince him to share information. That same day, Christopher went to Colleen's home to ask her about the progress of the search. Simultaneously, the FBI agents also visited Rowan's mother again. When they met with Christopher, they continued to ask him a few questions, and he once again confirmed that the events of that night happened exactly as he had described them. However, this time he also mentioned that he did not rule out the possibility that David was involved in Rowan's disappearance and expressed his desire to help them find the truth, no matter how frightening it might be. He suggested wearing a wiretap and approaching David to try to get him to confess. However, the detectives decided not to use such tactics. Instead, they asked Christopher if he could think of any locations where his friend might have hidden Rowan's body, and he suggested several places. The next day, the police began investigating these locations while continuing to search the area around Stella's house. FBI agents once again brought David in for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives also searched David's house in the hope of finding clues, but nothing was discovered. On November 7th, the police asked Christopher to return to the station to obtain his consent to search the safe in David's home. Christopher had been living with David for several months due to not having his own place, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave the police permission to search the safe, his trailer, and his car. He also voluntarily provided a DNA sample and agreed to answer additional questions from the detectives. They began questioning him that evening and again asked him to confirm David's story. This time, however, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story was not entirely true. The investigators began to pressure him to tell them what really happened. This pressure caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and try to implicate him in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue the conversation. The detectives then had to end the interview, and Christopher left the station. That night, he went to see Chief Clark and told him the whole story. He complained that the detectives were treating him as a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The chief replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were only doing what they could to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would not speak to them anymore and that if he wanted to share any more information, he would only speak to Sheriff Clark. He continued to persuade Christopher to share what he knew. After a while, Christopher began to cry and said that he had always loved Rowan and would never hurt her. During his time living in David's house, Christopher developed a close relationship with Rowan and the other children. They began to consider him a member of the family and even called him Uncle Christopher. Sheriff Clark realized that Christopher was about to reveal everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to share, someone came to the police station, causing Sheriff Clark to temporarily lose focus. Christopher then left the office without revealing what he was about to say. Sheriff Clark eventually contacted the FBI and informed them about the conversation. He explained that Christopher was willing to share most of what he knew but warned that if he was pressed too hard, Christopher might refuse to talk and seek legal counsel. Clark offered to give Christopher time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day without success. However, the situation changed on November 9th, a week after Rowan went missing. Search parties found Rowan's body in a remote area near a town called Powell, about 10 miles from where Stella lived. The body was covered in leaves and debris, with only a sock remaining. Medical examiners determined that Rowan had been strangled and sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body was discovered, FBI agents contacted Chief Clark and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would reveal more information. The chief learned that Christopher had come to the police station earlier that morning when Chief Clark was not there and had informed other officers that he urgently needed to see him. The chief searched everywhere for Christopher but could not find him. Christopher then contacted Chief Clark himself. He expressed obvious distress and concern that he was being followed. He explained that after hearing about the discovery of Rowan's body, he had driven around town to calm down and had noticed a gray car following him. Chief Clark claimed to be unaware of any surveillance activity and asked to meet Christopher directly. When Christopher met with the investigators, he expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after the discovery of Rowan's body, he might be charged with murder and that someone would take revenge on him. Clark took him to the police station and explained that now that the case had been ruled a murder, it was time for him to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began to cry. The sheriff asked him to tell him what David had done to Rowan. Christopher said that there were too many people at the police station and that he did not want to discuss it there. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge a few miles from their town. The sheriff agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher suddenly raised his hands and asked the police to handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and said that it was unnecessary, but Christopher insisted that after what he had said, the police had to do so. Christopher then began to recount the story he had told the police many times. He went to his trailer with Nathan and David, where they continued drinking. After a while, his friends decided to go home, and David asked Nathan to drive them. They said they would take a detour to avoid the police. However, Christopher then suddenly announced that he wanted to sexually assault Rowan and that he planned to do so. Knowing that it would take his friends a long time to take a detour through the fields, he drove straight to David's house on the main highway. He then barged into Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to his car, intending not to wake her. Christopher then took Rowan to his trailer, where he assaulted her. According to Christopher, Rowan had just woken up and tried to resist but was unable to escape. Christopher did not turn on the lights or talk to Rowan because he did not want her to recognize him. After committing this act, Christopher intended to take Rowan home and leave. But the plan did not go as intended. When Christopher carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly, and Rowan saw Christopher's face clearly. Panicking, Christopher grabbed a rope and strangled her. When she died, he loaded her body into the car and began to think about what to do next. Initially, he wanted to throw her off the bridge, the same bridge where he stood with Sheriff Clark, but he realized her body would be found too quickly. So, he got into the driver's seat and started driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered a large pit near a neighboring town and headed there. He threw the victim's body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large to cover completely. When he returned to the car, he noticed traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and the mattress. Christopher realized he needed to get rid of the pants, underwear, and rope used to kill the victim. He gathered all of these items and planned to put them in a large barrel to burn. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would certainly attract attention, so he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and set it on fire. Sheriff Clark was surprised by this story. He had previously believed that David had committed the crime and that Christopher was just hiding some information. It was hard to believe that a man he had known for nearly 20 years could be so brutal. Christopher had 3 young children, and although he had not lived with them since his divorce, he had always seemed like a nice man. But the truth was much colder. After Christopher finished telling his story, he voluntarily went to the police station. The sheriff did not handcuff him. It was only after they arrived and the man repeated his confession to the FBI agents that he was arrested for murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent form to allow his trailer and car to be searched. He eventually said that he regretted his actions and cried like a baby all the next day. Investigators went to inform David that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Based on David's behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been protecting his friend. However, they discovered something even more shocking. When brought in for questioning, David changed his testimony of events. According to David's testimony, when he came home and found Rowan not in her room, he suspected that Christopher might have kidnapped her. So he took his mother's car and drove to Christopher's trailer. When David entered the trailer, he found her lying on the bed with Christopher. Instead of saving Rowan, David decided to join in and bully her as well. David then helped his friend dispose of the body. He stated that throughout the incident, he was shocked and could not remember anything that happened. The detectives, who were initially surprised by this incident, contacted Christopher again to confirm David's statement. However, Christopher insisted that his friend was not involved and that everything happened exactly as he had previously said. This further confused the detectives, but Christopher's statement was consistent with the facts. A medical expert confirmed that Rowan had been strangled with a thin wire, a detail that only the killer would know. During the search of the trailer, the police found a container of ashes. In addition, they found a hair in the trailer that matched Rowan's. Although investigators were unable to determine who was telling the truth, both men made accusations against one another. As a result, David was also arrested, and both cases went to trial. During the trial, Christopher requested that all of his statements be removed from the record, arguing that he did not know they could be used against him and that the police had violated his rights. However, the judge rejected this request because all of his conversations with investigators had been completely voluntary. Christopher also tried to explain the difficult circumstances of his childhood. He had experienced many family changes since he was young, which had a significant impact on his development. Christopher also saw a specialist who confirmed that he exhibited signs of developmental problems but could not help him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the conviction but was unsuccessful. For David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to attacking and killing Rowan, but his testimony contradicted Christopher's. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, Christopher's conviction would likely be overturned, and David could also evade responsibility because there was no solid evidence against him, such as DNA. The prosecution could not afford to make such a risky claim. In fact, they were still uncertain about David's involvement in the case. They did not rule out the possibility that David had committed the crime alongside Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made. To avoid the risk of overturning Christopher's conviction, they reduced David's charges to significantly lesser ones. David pleaded guilty to 2 counts, child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to serve. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Susan Reinert. Susan Reinert, known to many as Sue, was born in 1943 in the town of Ridgeway, northwestern Pennsylvania. Her parents, William and Jane Gallagher, were a significant influence on her early life. Her father managed a newspaper, while her mother was a dedicated school teacher, which later shaped her path. As a child, Susan demonstrated a clear passion for learning and a natural love for literature, following in her mother's footsteps. She pursued higher education at Grove City College, where she met Kenneth Reinert, a young Air Force enlistee. Their chance encounter blossomed into a romance as they studied together. Susan's determination paid off as she earned her bachelor's degree. After achieving her initial goal, Susan pursued further education, earning a master's degree in English from Pennsylvania State University in 1966. She had married Kenneth in 1965, shortly after graduating from Grove City College, and they began a life filled with adventure as a military couple, moving to various duty stations across the country. Their military life took them to different parts of the country, including Sacramento, California, Rome, New York, and even Puerto Rico, before they eventually settled in the Philadelphia region. However, in 1971, Susan and Kenneth decided to separate, marking the end of their marriage. Despite the divorce, they parted ways amicably, without any legal disputes. As a single mother, Susan focused on creating a warm and loving home for her 2 children, Karen and Michael. She was a dedicated teacher and a beloved colleague and educator at Chestnut Wald Elementary School, known for her friendly and warm nature. Outside of her professional life, Susan was actively involved in Parents Without Partners, playing a crucial role in the Valley Forge chapter. After her mother's death, Susan found comfort in her connection with the organization Parents Without Partners. Despite facing challenges, she remained strong, relying on the organization for support. As she navigated her grief and a significant inheritance, her life became increasingly complex. However, she seemed to be managing well thanks to her strong ability to cope and a supportive network. On the evening of June 22, 1979, Susan and her 2 children spent what would be their last day together. Earlier that day, her son Michael had spent time with his father Kenneth, a personnel officer at Fidelity Bank. They had played in a father-son softball game, but left early when Susan arrived to pick Michael up around 8:30 p.m. Later that evening, Michael called his father to apologize for leaving the game early. Susan also called her former in-laws, Florence and John Reinhardt, with whom she remained close despite her divorce. With a full tank of gas, Susan was prepared for the drive to Allentown, Pennsylvania, about an hour north. She planned to attend a Parents Without Partners conference and use the trip as a weekend getaway with her children. Susan had planned a weekend getaway with her two children, Karen, 11 years old, and Michael, 10 years old. They were supposed to leave on Saturday morning to attend events, but on Friday evening, around 9 p.m., they unexpectedly departed. The children had been outside collecting hailstones from a summer storm, and shortly after, neighbors heard Susan's car start up and saw it leave the driveway. Susan had been having an affair with William Bradfield, a fellow teacher, which had put a strain on her marriage to Kenneth. Rumors had circulated that Susan and Bradfield might get married. On June 22, 1979, Susan visited her boyfriend before embarking on a trip with her children to Allentown, about 49 miles north. They had planned to spend the night in a motel, but instead of arriving at their destination, Susan and her children vanished. 2 days after Susan Reinert and her children vanished, the community cared for them deeply was overcome with concern and uncertainty. On June 25, 1979, their fears were realized when Susan's orange Plymouth hatchback was found in the Hostin Hotel parking lot in Harrisburg, 87 miles from Allentown and 97 miles from her home. Tragically, her body was discovered in the back of the vehicle. The details of her death were horrific. Susan's body was found nude, battered, and bound in chains, curled up in the wheel well of her car. Her hands were tied, and she had 2 black eyes. It appeared that she had been either beaten with chains or tied so tightly that the chains had caused severe bruising on her back. To make matters worse, she had been given a lethal dose of morphine. The disappearance of her 2 children remained a mystery, however, with no signs of their whereabouts. Police were left searching for answers, with the children seemingly vanished into thin air. The police searched for hours, hoping to find Susan's children with a babysitter, but none of her regular sitters, friends, or family members had seen them that weekend. As a result, the police began investigating to find answers. To gather leads, the police published pictures of the Reinert family in newspapers for weeks. This was before the internet and Amber Alerts existed, making it more challenging to disseminate information quickly. As the investigation continued, it was discovered that Susan Reinert had named William Bradfield, the man she believed she would marry, as the beneficiary of life insurance policies worth $730,000. This revelation raised suspicions that the children might have been killed to allow Bradfield to receive the substantial financial windfall. However, Bradfield had a solid alibi, as he was at the beach in Cape May, New Jersey, during the weekend when Susan was killed and her children disappeared. Several other teachers were with him and could vouch for his whereabouts. The police then shifted their focus to Upper Marin High School, where Susan worked. The school was facing several difficulties and challenges. The principal, J.C. Smith, had been involved in a scandal. He had been fired the previous year, being arrested at a local shopping center, where a search of his Ford Granada revealed loaded handguns, a hooded mask, and various tools associated with burglary. Additionally, a syringe filled with morphine was found in his trunk. Jay's life was already unraveling before his wife's cancer diagnosis. In 1977, his wife was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, which she would eventually succumb to in August 1979. During her illness, she kept a diary, documenting her husband's increasingly bizarre behavior. Jay had begun engaging in consensual non-monogamous activities, including group sex and partner swapping, to which his wife strongly objected. This behavior seemed to be a precursor to even more alarming actions. Around the same time, their daughter, Stephanie, moved back in with her parents, bringing her husband Edward Hunsberger with her. The family was already dealing with the uncertainty of her mother's cancer battle, and tensions were running high among them. Edward Hunsberger and his wife Stephanie, Jay's daughter and son-in-law, struggled with heroin addiction and had trouble finding steady employment in the years leading up to their move. In an effort to escape their struggles with addiction, they moved back in with Jay's family in early 1978. However, just a few months after the move, Stephanie and Edward mysteriously vanished. The last confirmed sighting of they was in February 1978, when they visited Edward's parents in North Wales, Pennsylvania. Before leaving, they mentioned that they would return to visit soon. However, after this point, all contact with them ceased. Edward failed to appear at a scheduled meeting with his probation officer later that month, prompting authorities to begin searching for him and Stephanie. When investigators reached out to Jay for information, he claimed that they had left for California to escape debts owed to local drug dealers. Despite his assertions, Jay was unable to provide any further details about their disappearance. Edward and Stephanie had been constantly on the move, traveling from place to place and never staying in one location for too long, making it easy for them to disappear without anyone noticing. Meanwhile, Jay was arrested for theft, and a search of his home uncovered some disturbing items. Authorities found firearms, marijuana, prescription pills, security guard uniforms and badges, as well as disturbing pornography. They also discovered nitric acid and stolen office equipment from a local school. Jay was linked to a string of recent armed robberies matching his description and attire. While awaiting sentencing for the theft charge, Jay's alibi witness, Bradfield, testified that they were on vacation during the time of the robberies. However, the jury did not find Bradfield's testimony credible. Jay had a notorious reputation at Upper Merion, earning him the nickname, the Prince of Darkness. This was especially relevant in the investigation of Susan's death, which was caused by strangulation or suffocation. The time frame for her death was broad, and when questioned about his whereabouts, Jay couldn't provide a clear answer. The autopsy found that Susan's body had an extremely high amount of morphine, roughly 10 times the amount needed to be fatal, which indicates that her overdose was likely a deliberate act. As the investigation into Susan's death continued, Jay was found guilty of a series of store robberies in the late 1970s. He was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison on June 25, 1979. However, even behind bars, Jay remained a key suspect in the investigation into Susan's death. The police began to dig deeper into his past, uncovering a disturbing discovery. Jay's daughter and son-in-law had gone missing in similar circumstances to Susan and her children. There were two main connections between Jay and the disappearances. Firstly, large quantities of morphine had been discovered in Jay's house a few months earlier. Secondly, a plastic comb with Jay's military unit was found in Susan's car. The disappearances of Jay's daughter and son-in-law shared striking similarities with the disappearance of Susan's children. The investigation revealed a shocking series of events that had a lasting impact on the public. However, the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In late July 1979, about a month after Susan's body was discovered near Harrisburg, investigators stumbled upon a potential motive for the crime. In her official documents, Susan referred to Bradfield as her future husband. As the police investigated further, they determined that Susan's death occurred between midnight on Saturday, June 23, 1979, and midnight on Sunday, June 24. Bradfield and his colleagues arrived in Cape Cod at 5 a.m. on Saturday and stayed until Monday afternoon, June 25. However, there was a gap in Bradfield's alibi, as his exact whereabouts during the time of Susan's disappearance were unclear. Investigations also revealed that Susan had withdrawn large sums of money from her accounts, totaling around $25,000. She had told bank employees that she planned to invest the money in high-yielding investments managed by Bradfield, whom she trusted as her future husband. Unbeknownst to Susan, Bradfield was leading a double life, dating multiple women, including a fellow English teacher, with whom he had a secret relationship spanning nearly a decade. Bradfield had promised Susan that he would handle her investments and assured her they would be profitable, providing a way for they to fund their upcoming wedding and move to England. However, investigators found fake stocks and bonds in Susan's home, which were actually forgeries created by Bradfield. He had sold these worthless securities to Susan, using fictional companies to make them appear legitimate. This discovery added a new dimension to the narrative, revealing a significant financial motive. Bradfield was required to testify in a lawsuit in March 1980 but initially refused to answer questions, referring them to his lawyers instead. His lawyers denied any wrongdoing but were open to negotiating a settlement to resolve the matter and distribute Susan's estate, which was worth approximately $7 million. In June 1980, Bradfield testified in a civil trial, downplaying his involvement in the case. He contradicted Susan's claims about their relationship, saying it was not as serious as she had told others. He denied plans to marry Susan later that year, despite her having shared these plans with multiple people. Bradfield also made an unsubstantiated claim that Susan had an affair with J. Smith, the former principal of her high school, but this accusation was not supported by any evidence. Friends and family members remembered Susan being in a long-term relationship with Bradfield, with no indication of a relationship with J. Smith, who was actually in prison at the time of the trial. Bradfield failed to explain why Susan had named him the beneficiary of her $1 million estate. Instead, he portrayed Susan as an irresponsible person who frequently got into trouble, and he blamed her for her problems, claiming he was only trying to help her deal with the consequences. As the investigation into the missing $25,000 continued, Susan's brother and ex-husband filed a second lawsuit in June 1980 to claim the $450,000 life insurance policy taken out on Susan's life just before her death. The goal was to use the funds to conduct a private investigation. However, the case took a surprising turn when Bradfield was arrested on February 20, 1981, and charged with 2 counts of theft and 1 count of conspiracy related to the $25,000. Wendy Ziegler, a former student of Bradfield's, was also charged as a co-conspirator in the case. Bradfield was released on bail on February 23, 1981, and was set to go on trial the following month. However, the trial was preempted when the original civil lawsuit was settled out of court. As a result of the settlement, $36,000 from Susan's estate was set aside to cover the costs of further investigations into the disappearance of the children and to contest certain provisions of Susan's will. Bradfield's 5-day trial ended on August 3, 1981, with a guilty verdict for theft. The prosecutor, Edward Weiss, requested that Bradfield's bond be increased from $25,000 to $75,000 due to concerns that the conviction would increase the risk of him fleeing, particularly in light of potential murder charges. Judge Robert A. Wright granted this request. On April 6, 1983, Pennsylvania state troopers arrested Bradfield and charged him with multiple crimes, including 3 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and obstructing the law. A grand jury found evidence that Bradfield was aware of the plot to kill Susan and her children and had likely participated in these crimes. Although J.C. Smith, a suspected accomplice, was not charged at that time, a confession from a fellow inmate, Proctor Noel, implicated Bradfield. Noel stated that while playing chess with Bradfield in prison, Bradfield revealed his involvement in the murders. Despite the lack of direct physical evidence linking Bradfield to the crimes, prosecutors felt they had a strong case against him. A previous conviction for theft also bolstered their confidence, as did a potential connection to a person who may have disposed of the victims' bodies, which further implicated Bradfield in the murders that occurred in the 1980s. J.C. Smith was forced to testify before a grand jury in 1984, despite invoking his Fifth Amendment right. The questioning was likely related to the disappearance of his daughter, Stephanie, and her husband, Edward Huntsberger. Around the same time, William Bradfield was also called to testify, but the details of his statements were not made public. In April 1985, J.C. Smith was asked to provide handwriting samples that may have been linked to documents written years earlier, possibly outlining a plan to murder Susan Reinert. This led to Jay's arrest on June 25, 1985, exactly 6 years after Susan's body was found. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and taken into custody. While Jay awaited trial, a book about the case was published by crime author Joseph Wambaugh in 1984, suggesting that Smith was the killer. The book was later adapted into a TV miniseries, drawing national attention to the case. Despite this, Jay maintained his innocence from prison, filing appeals and claiming that William Bradfield had framed him. In 1989, the court decided to re-examine Jay's case and discovered problems with the prosecution's handling of the case. This led to a new trial in 1990. Jay waived his right to a speedy trial to allow for a thorough investigation. By 1992, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in Jay's favor, overturning his murder conviction due to issues with the prosecution's conduct. For 20 years, the state did not pursue a new trial against J.C. Smith, allowing him to live the rest of his life without further prosecution. Meanwhile, William Bradfield continuously disregarded court orders and refused to pay the $25,000 he owed to the estate of Susan Reinert. This issue was finally resolved in a settlement in 1996. J.C. Smith went on to file lawsuits against the state and Joseph Wambaugh, claiming defamation and conspiracy. However, both suits were eventually dismissed. On January 16, 1998, William Bradfield, who had been in prison for over a decade, was found unresponsive in his cell and pronounced dead due to cardiac arrest. Kenneth Reinert, the ex-husband of Susan Reinert, passed away in June 2002 without ever knowing what happened to their 2 missing children. J.C. Smith, whose conviction was overturned in 1992, wrote books about the case and remarried in 2002. He died on May 12, 2009, leaving many questions about his involvement in the 1978 disappearance of his daughter and son-in-law, Stephanie and Edward Huntsberger, still unanswered. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Kouri Richens. Eric Richens was born on May 13, 1982, and his life had a profound impact on those around him. Eric was a sports enthusiast who actively participated in basketball, baseball, and soccer. He had a particular passion for outdoor activities, especially hunting. His love for the outdoors was evident in the numerous trophies he collected from around the world. Eric was a fun-loving person who lived in Utah and enjoyed exploring the outdoors with his many motorized vehicles. He was also deeply committed to his faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. With his family's support, Eric served a 2-year mission in Mexico City, where he became fluent in Spanish. After high school, Eric attended the University of Utah, graduating in 2009 with a degree in international studies and a minor in Spanish. It was during this time that he met Kouri Richens, who worked at Home Depot. Eric, who often visited the store for work, developed a friendly relationship with Kouri and was drawn to her charm and beauty. However, he was too nervous to approach her directly, so he asked a friend to help him get her contact information. While shopping at Home Depot, a friend of Eric's approached Kouri and quietly asked for her phone number, saying that Eric wanted to get to know her better. Eric called Kouri and they arranged to meet in person. Eric and Kouri clicked immediately when they met. Their connection was real, and their first date marked the start of a wonderful romance. As they met each other's families, their relationship grew even stronger. Kouri's family welcomed Eric with open arms, and Eric's family was just as impressed with Kouri's kindness and how well she fit in with them. Eric's 2 older sisters, Katie and Amy, were initially cautious of Kouri, but they soon grew fond of and accepted Kouri. In 2013, Eric and Kouri tied the knot in a private ceremony, marking the beginning of their life together. They welcomed their first child, Carter, shortly after. The family continued to grow with the arrival of Ashton and then Weston, completing their happy family portrait. As a father, Eric found his footing quickly. His sons looked up to him and admired everything he did. Eric, in turn, took immense pride in his children's accomplishments, whether it was their academic achievements, sports victories, or creative pursuits. He was always present to support and celebrate their successes. Eric's entrepreneurial spirit led him to start a stonemasonry business, which flourished due to his exceptional craftsmanship and attention to detail. As a result, his business attracted many clients, providing financial security for Eric and his family. Kouri was a successful real estate entrepreneur who contributed significantly to the family's income. Her expertise in the local market and business acumen made her a valuable partner in their growing family. She would buy homes, renovate them, and sell them at a profit. The Kouri family appeared to have it all, with a lifestyle that seemed perfect on the surface. But beneath this facade, trouble was brewing. On March 4, 2020, the illusion of perfection shattered when Kouri called 911 to report that her husband Eric was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they found that Eric had already passed away. Kouri was devastated by the news and immediately called her mother, Lisa, who rushed to her side. Kouri's brothers, DJ and Ronnie, also joined them, and together they struggled to come to terms with the loss. Earlier that night, Kouri had been celebrating a business success with Eric, marking the purchase of a mansion for her real estate company. Before bed, she had made Eric a Moscow Mule, a drink made with ginger beer and vodka. Kouri had gone to bed around 9 p.m., but instead of sleeping in her own bed, she had lain down with her 9-year-old son in his room because he was having nightmares. Kouri returned to her bedroom around 3 a.m. and found Eric unresponsive. When she touched Eric, she felt that her husband was extremely cold. Realizing that something was wrong, Kouri waited for paramedics to arrive and followed the dispatcher's instructions to perform CPR on Eric. Kouri claimed to have followed the instructions given to her. However, the paramedics were unsure what caused Eric's death, and the lack of information led them to consider the possibility of an aneurysm, given that Eric was a 39-year-old man with no known medical conditions. Further investigation revealed that Eric had complained of chest pains to Kouri the night before he died, which initially strengthened the suspicion of an aneurysm. The autopsy results were unexpected and came as a surprise to all parties involved in the case. It was discovered that Eric died from a fatal dose of fentanyl, a powerful painkiller that can be fatal if overdosed. From the moment Eric died, his family began to suspect that his recreational drug use may have contributed to the fentanyl in his system. Kouri explained that Eric used a nightly THC gummy as a way to unwind after a long day. However, the family had concerns about where Eric was getting these gummies. They suspected that Eric wasn't always buying them from trustworthy sources, and that he might have been purchasing them on the street instead. Eric's mother-in-law, Lisa, was particularly worried because Eric had a history of recreational drug use and may have also bought pain pills from street vendors without knowing they might contain fentanyl, unknowingly putting his life at risk. Eric's family strongly rejected the allegations, convinced that something else was responsible and encouraging investigators to consider other possibilities. Meanwhile, Kouri struggled to rebuild her life. According to her brother Ronnie, she faced numerous challenges, including the void left by her husband's absence. To manage her grief and comfort her children, Kouri found a creative outlet. She self-published a children's book, Are You With Me? On Amazon, aiming to help kids deal with the loss of a loved one. The book tells the story of a boy missing his deceased father through illustrations and storytelling, allowing Kouri to channel her emotions into a positive project. Kouri portrayed Eric as a constant, loving presence in her book, watching over their son. Her mother, Lisa, appreciated the book, saying it helped her family cope with their emotions and find some comfort. However, as detectives looked into Eric's death, they suspected foul play was involved. In a shocking twist, Kouri was arrested and charged with her husband's murder on May 8, 2023, just weeks after she had publicly shared her grief and promoted her book on local Utah news stations. The community was stunned by the news, struggling to understand the sudden turn of events. Kouri, who initially gained public sympathy for her efforts to help children cope with loss, has become embroiled in a devastating scandal. According to court documents, Kouri allegedly killed her husband Eric by administering a lethal dose of a poison. Kouri intentionally spiked Eric's drink, a Moscow Mule, with a fatal amount of fentanyl on the night of his death. However, Kouri's lawyer disputes this, stating that no fentanyl was found on the glassware at their home. Kouri denies any involvement in Eric's death, insisting she had no reason to harm him. Kouri's mother, Lisa, has expressed shock and confusion over the allegations, maintaining that they was happy and had no issues that would have led Kouri to kill Eric. During the investigation, detectives discovered that Kouri and Eric's relationship was not as perfect as it appeared. They had their differences, and Kouri, a stay-at-home mother, craved independence. She was also annoyed by Eric's frequent hunting trips. Lisa claimed that Eric was having an affair, but his family denied this. They sought counseling, but Eric's family said it was because he loved his sons and wanted to make the marriage work. Eric considered divorce and took steps to protect his assets, secretly setting up a trust with his sister Katie. During the investigation, 6 life insurance policies on Eric were found, totaling $3 million. 2 months prior to his death, Kouri had also forged Eric's signature on another policy valued at $100,000. It was also discovered that Kouri had been embezzling money from Eric's personal accounts and misusing funds from his business over several years. Kouri's financial situation was reportedly dire, despite claims that her house-flipping business was thriving. In reality, the business was millions of dollars in debt. According to Eric's family representative, Kouri urgently needed money. A premarital agreement, signed by Kouri, revealed that she had waived her claim to Eric's business assets. However, if Eric were to die before her while they were still married, she would inherit the assets. Kouri's lawyer denied the claims that her business was in debt. They explained that taking out lines of credit was a normal part of the house flipping business, and that the debt would be paid off when the houses were sold. The lawyer also clarified that the large amount of debt mentioned by the spokesperson was simply a result of normal business transactions. Kouri's mother, Lisa, stated that Eric had been very supportive of Kouri's business ventures, especially when it came to buying Hilton, where they were celebrating on the night of his death. Hilton was situated on a 10-acre estate in Heber Valley, close to popular ski resorts and Deer Creek Reservoir. Kouri discovered a long-abandoned mansion that had been built in 2017. She joined forces with a group of investors to make a substantial offer on the property, using their collective resources to finance the purchase. Her plan was to transform the estate into a popular recreational destination. Although Eric initially seemed to support the purchase, his family later disputed this claim. They recalled that Eric had strongly opposed the idea of buying Hilton and had even argued with Kouri about it. The family's spokesperson made a shocking allegation: on the night of Eric's death, Kouri had given him a drink spiked with fentanyl. Furthermore, they claimed that this was not the first time Kouri had attempted to harm Eric. Eric's family claims Kouri tried to harm him twice. First, during a 2019 trip to Greece, they say Kouri gave Eric a drink that made him violently ill. Kouri's brother Ronnie disputes this, suggesting Eric was taking antibiotics and shouldn't have had liquor. Ronnie says the bartender may have made a mistake, preparing a drink with liquor instead of the virgin drink Eric ordered. A second incident allegedly occurred on Valentine's Day 2022, 1 month before Eric's death. Kouri brought Eric a sandwich that caused him to break out in hives and have trouble breathing. The court documents stated that 2 days after Eric's death, Kouri punched his sister Amy in the neck and face when she tried to open a safe containing between $125,000 and $165,000 in cash. Kouri claimed she was acting in self-defense when she tried to retrieve important documents from a safe. However, she was charged with assault a month after the incident and eventually pleaded no contest. In June 2023, Kouri attended a bail hearing, which lasted 4 hours. During the hearing, prosecutors presented 3 witnesses and evidence to support their claim that Kouri had poisoned her husband. A cell phone expert testified about Google searches found on Kouri's phone, including inquiries about retrieving deleted text messages from an iPhone, whether the FBI could access deleted messages, and the lethal dose of fentanyl. However, Kouri's attorney argued that these searches were conducted after her husband's death, as Kouri sought information to defend herself against accusations of murder. Prosecutors also contacted the lead detective involved in the case and questioned him about any potential sources that Kouri could have used to obtain the drugs that were used to kill Eric. The detective shared information from an interview with Carmen Labor, a woman who claimed to work as a cleaner for Kouri's business and home. In early 2022, Carmen told investigators about a conversation she had with Kouri. Kouri asked her to buy fentanyl for an investor who supposedly had a back injury. Carmen, who had a history of drug-related crimes and was on probation for distributing drugs at the time of the interview, agreed to Kouri's request. She said she bought 15 to 30 fentanyl pills and later met with Kouri to exchange them for cash. This exchange happened on February 11, 2022, just 3 days before Valentine's Day, when Kouri allegedly tried to poison Eric with a sandwich. During the investigation, Carmen told the detective that Kouri contacted her again, asking for stronger drugs. This time, Carmen revealed that Kouri paid her for the pills with a check. A week after Eric's death, Kouri gave Carmen a $1,300 check. However, Kouri's lawyer disputed this, suggesting that the check could have been for cleaning services instead of payment for drugs. The detective agreed that this was a possible explanation. Kouri's lawyer also questioned Carmen's credibility, pointing out that she was a convicted felon on probation for serious crimes. The lawyer argued that Carmen's history made her an unreliable witness. They claimed that Carmen might have lied about selling the drugs because the detective told her she would face a long prison sentence if she didn't cooperate with the investigation. Kouri's lawyer asked if there was any physical evidence to prove that Carmen had bought the drugs. The detective replied that no such evidence existed. Specifically, no text messages were found where Kouri directly asked Carmen for drugs. Additionally, no witnesses came forward to confirm that they saw Carmen and Kouri exchanging drugs. Eric's sister pleaded with the judge at the bail hearing to keep Kouri in custody, sharing the family's trauma and concerns about reliving the horrific circumstances of Eric's death if Kouri was released on bail. The judge granted the request and denied Kouri bail. However, Kouri's family was upset by the decision and worried about her well-being in jail. They felt that her time in custody was affecting her physically and mentally. Kouri experienced a health scare in jail after taking prescribed medication. She suffered a seizure and was rushed to the hospital. She claimed that jail officials had given her the wrong medication, leading to severe side effects. Thankfully, Kouri recovered after receiving medical treatment. Jail officials found a handwritten letter in Kouri's cell after she was hospitalized. The letter was never sent, but it was included in the court records and presented by prosecutors as evidence. They claimed it was written by Kouri to her mother and showed her intentions and motivations. Prosecutors asked the court to limit Kouri's contact with her mother and brothers in November 2023. The main reason was the letter found in Kouri's cell, which prosecutors said was an attempt to influence witnesses. They alleged that in the letter, Kouri gave her mother instructions on how her brother Ronnie should behave in court. Kouri allegedly asked Ronnie to lie about Eric's behavior during a trip to Mexico. Specifically, Kouri wanted Ronnie to falsely testify that Eric had admitted to buying pain pills in Mexico. Kouri also told Ronnie to gather text messages from Eric that discussed his drug use. Kouri stressed the importance of linking Eric's activities in Mexico to his alleged involvement with drugs. However, Kouri claimed that the letter was not an attempt to tamper with a witness, but rather a work of fiction. A judge agreed, stating that the prosecution had failed to prove that Kouri was attempting to interfere with the testimony. Currently, Kouri and her family are trying to gain custody of their 3 sons, who are living with a relative. Despite being in jail, Kouri regularly talks to her children through video calls. Her family attends their public events, but is not allowed private visits with they. Kouri faces severe penalties if found guilty of murdering her husband Eric by lacing his drink with fentanyl. She could receive a prison sentence ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment. Moreover, she is dealing with multiple civil lawsuits related to Eric's estate, including disputes over custody of their children. The outcome of these custody battles has significant financial implications, as control of the children grants control over Eric's estate, fueling tensions between Kouri's and Eric's families. Kouri's trial is expected to begin sometime in 2025. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Kristen Smart. Kristen Denise Smart was born on February 20, 1977, in Augsburg, Bavaria, West Germany. She was raised by her parents, Stan and Denise Smart. When she was young, the family moved to Stockton, California. She is the oldest of 3 children. Kristen's mother, Denise, often called her a dreamer. Kristen loved the ocean and had an adventurous spirit. She was truly passionate about experiencing life. Kristen graduated from Lincoln High School in Stockton in 1995. Before college, she worked as a lifeguard and a summer camp counselor at Camp Mokulea in Hawaii. In 1996, Kristen enrolled at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. She was ambitious but indecisive. Kristen initially enrolled at Cal Poly to study architecture because she loved to draw, but later changed her major to communication studies. Denise said that Kristen wanted to travel the world as a reporter. On Memorial Day weekend in 1996, Kristen called home and left a voicemail, "Good news, good news. I'll call home Sunday." Kristen was in regular contact with her family every Sunday. That day, Kristen had attended an off-campus birthday party that Friday night. Her friend, Margarita Campos, recalled taking her there. Margarita said Kristen seemed a little upset that Margarita couldn't join her that night. Margarita's last words to Kristen were to be careful. Kristen was wearing a gray cropped t-shirt, black shorts, and red Puma sneakers. As the party was winding down, at 2 a.m., classmate Tim Davis found Kristen unconscious on the grass nearby. He and another classmate and acquaintance of Kristen's, Cheryl Anderson, helped her walk back to the school dormitory. Paul Florist then approached Kristen and offered to help her get back to her dorm, saying he was leaving the party. Paul, Kristen, and Cheryl returned to campus, and since Davis lived off campus, he could not accompany them. Once the 3 of them were alone, Cheryl began to notice Paul's strange behavior. She noticed the many unexpected stops along the way and the way he interacted with Kristen. While walking, Paul would frequently hold Kristen around the waist, and Kristen would also wrap her arms around his neck. This made Cheryl even more curious, especially when Paul suggested that Cheryl walk ahead while he and Kristen tried to catch up. Cheryl eventually went her own way, but not before reminding Paul to make sure Kristen returned safely. Paul claimed that he had dropped Kristen off at the intersection of the hallways leading to both of their dorms. It was around 2:30 a.m. on May 25, 1996. Kristen Smart was never seen again. When Sunday passed without a call from Kristen's roommates and neighbors thought something was wrong. They contacted the university police department to report Kristen missing, but no report was filed. Concerned, they called Kristen's family and the San Luis Obispo Police Department. 5 days after Kristen went missing, Paul was interviewed by UPD investigators. Paul said that the two had gone their separate ways at the intersection. However, investigators quickly noticed Paul's black eye. When asked about it, Paul explained that he had injured it during a basketball game. But a friend later disputed this story, stating that Paul's black eye had appeared before the basketball game. Paul told the friend that he didn't know how he got the black eye, he just woke up with it. A month later, Paul was interviewed again and confessed that he had lied about the black eye incident. This time, Paul said that he had hit his eye on the steering wheel of a truck. However, when questioned further, Paul admitted that this story didn't make sense either. He said he was in the truck at about 2 a.m. on May 27, 1996, and was installing a car radio because he was selling the truck. A search for Kristen began. Search dogs were used on June 29, 1996. For dogs trained to search for human remains were used individually to search for clues at the dormitory. Santa Lucia Hall. Each dog was sent to room 128, Paul Flores' room. The dogs showed no interest in the room, except for the corner of a mattress. Dog handler Carta Adela Morris said the dogs can detect the slightest physiological changes. During the search, their reactions suggested a high probability that there was a body in room 128. Another handler also recalled her dog's behavior while searching room 128. The dog searched the left side of the room several times, and Tori's behavior and strong reactions suggested that she had picked up the scent of something, but was still searching for its source. Although Paul Flores remained the prime suspect, no formal charges were ever filed. During that time, Paul Flores continued to live his life freely, although he was suspected by the police. From 1996 to 2007, the investigation continued, and searches were conducted at every possible location, including 4 properties owned by the Flores family. However, none of these searches yielded positive results. On the advice of his attorney, Paul Flores decided not to answer any questions by exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. A person who invokes this provision has the right to remain silent and is not required to provide information that could incriminate them. During his 1997 deposition, Paul exercised this right and remained silent. This made it difficult for investigators, especially attorney James R. Murphy, as they were unable to find any new leads. Despite the overwhelming evidence linking Paul to the case, former Sheriff Ed Williams also admitted that he did not see a way to close the case. Paul's silence frustrated the authorities. The Smart family filed a wrongful death lawsuit for Kristen. However, the court decided not to proceed with charges. Kristen's case remains under criminal investigation. Paul and his family have refused to publicly address Kristen's case or the allegations against them. A roommate of Paul's, Derek C., said Paul joked about Kristen's disappearance. However, these allegations remain speculative as Paul has hired a lawyer to defend himself from further questioning. 6 years after her disappearance, Denise Smart said it was a difficult time. A longtime case follower, Chris Lambert, who was 8 at the time, was haunted by Kristen's disappearance. As he grew older, he wondered why the case of Kristen were still no answers. In 2018, Chris quit his job to create a podcast about the case full-time. With no formal training in law or journalism, he was driven only by his passion for finding answers. In 2019, Chris visited Kristen's memorial on her birthday and decided to wait to meet someone willing to talk about Kristen. Chris met Kristen's mother and began talking to her about her daughter. From there, Chris and the Smart family built a strong relationship and worked to bring Kristen's story to the public through the podcast, In Your Own Backyard. The podcast began as a local series but quickly went national and garnered over 11 million downloads. The core of the podcast follows the case of Kristen Smart and her disappearance from campus. Chris has a unique ability to get people to feel comfortable sharing information with him. He has interviewed many people who have been involved in the case to varying degrees. Chris is especially interested in witnesses who are reluctant to speak or have been ignored by investigators. He has uncovered many allegations that have been speculation for years. An interview with an Australian exchange student brought to light a possible fight between Kristen and Paul. According to Chris, the student allegedly saw Kristen fighting with Paul on the night of her disappearance. During the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance, several theories emerged. The first theory was that Paul Flores was injured in a fight with Kristen. The second theory was that Paul's father, Rowan Flores, helped cover up the crime. The third theory was that Kristen's body was buried in the Flores backyard. The investigation also revealed allegations of serious misconduct by Paul toward multiple women. Women who had attended school or worked with Paul reported his excessive flirting and excessive drinking. Several women accused Paul of sexual or physical assault, including harassment and controlling behavior. Chris attempted to contact Paul for an interview, but was unsuccessful. An interview could have cleared up some of the loose ends and given Paul a chance to address the allegations against him. However, Chris has not contacted Kristen's family. San Luis Obispo Police Chief and Parkinson praised Chris for his work in helping to advance the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance. Chris created a compelling, well-done podcast that drew people to the case. Parkinson noted that going public with the story convinced several people involved to come forward, which had a significant impact on the investigation. Denise Smart also thanked Chris for his hard work, saying that the podcast had created an opportunity for people to come together to seek the truth. She also thanked Sheriff Parkinson for helping to keep the case fresh since he took office in 2011. Although the Flores family has remained silent, the investigation and podcast have shaken their confidence. On January 29, 2020, 2 trucks owned by Paul Flores were presented as evidence. Then, on February 5 of that year, authorities executed search warrants at 4 different locations, including a home in Los Angeles. During the search, Paul Flores was briefly detained. On April 22, 2020, the Los Angeles Times reported that a search warrant was executed at Paul Flores' home in San Pedro, California. The search resulted in the recovery of several items of evidence, including date rape drugs and videos showing Paul Flores sexually assaulting young women. Paul Flores was subsequently arrested on February 11, 2021, in Palos Verdes, Rancho, California, on suspicion of being a felon in possession of a firearm. In March of that year, a search warrant was issued at the home of Paul's father, Rowan Flores, and police used dogs and ground-penetrating radar to search the property, and an older Volkswagen was towed away for evidence after the dogs conducted the search. On April 13, Paul and his father, Rowan, were arrested by the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department in connection with Kristen's case. Paul and Rowan were charged in the case involving Kristen. Paul was charged with murder, and Rowan was charged with accessory after the fact. Due to the statute of limitations, Paul was able to escape the sexual assault charge but still faced a first-degree murder charge for allegedly killing during attempted rape. In September 2021, a judge declared the case sufficient to go to trial in April 2022. However, the trial was postponed and moved to Monterey County. On July 18, 2022, Paul and Rowan's trials began simultaneously but with 2 separate jury groups. In his opening statement, Deputy Prosecutor Chris Pavril described Kristen as a young person who had been cruelly treated and taken too soon. He said Kristen's family was suffering from the unknown whereabouts of their daughter and blamed Paul Flores for this. The deputy prosecutor also presented evidence found at Ruben's home that showed both Paul and Ruben were responsible for Kristen's death and the disposal of her body. However, Paul's defense attorney, Robert Sanger, questioned the veracity of this evidence. He said it was a tragic situation that Kristen's body was never found and there was no DNA evidence. He stated that people believed she was dead, but there was no concrete evidence of what happened to her after Paul left her at the dorm. Since July, Paul Flores' trial has attracted public attention as multiple allegations of harassment and violence have been made. Several women have come forward to accuse Paul Flores of inappropriate behavior, including 2 women who call themselves Rondado and Saradu. Both women alleged that they met Paul Flores and then felt unusually lethargic, leading to memory loss. When they woke up, they said Paul Flores had abused them. Their detailed and emotional testimony brought jurors to tears, forcing Judge Jennifer O'Keefe to call a recess. In addition, testimony regarding the search of Ruben Flores' home also moved another juror to tears. Investigators and experts also attended the trial, providing more details about the case. Judge O'Keefe said the trial would be long and difficult, and jurors would likely be emotional at times. One of the key pieces of evidence presented at the trial was Jennifer Hudson's testimony. She said she met Paul Flores when she was 17, and that he told her that he had buried Kristen Smart under the slope in his backyard in Hawasna. This was one of the most important pieces of evidence presented at the trial. Paul's defense attorney questioned Jennifer's testimony and highlighted her recreational use of drugs and alcohol, calling into question her credibility. The attorney suggested that she was being dishonest in her answers to the question. In fact, Jennifer admitted in a social media post that she did not report the incident to police until after a podcast aired. She also canceled an interview with a detective after meeting with the podcast producer in 2019. The attorney went on to ask Jennifer if she thought Kristen Smart was buried in Susan Flores' backyard. She suggested that this was the most plausible explanation. When the attorney pursued the subject of Jennifer's association with biker gang members, the prosecutor objected to the question and the judge sided with them. During cross-examination, Pavril asked Jennifer to explain her previous testimony and that Jennifer felt responsible for the Smart family's suffering. She explained that if she had not been afraid, she would have spoken up sooner. Jennifer then broke down in tears. No reason was given, and the trial was adjourned after Jennifer's testimony. The trial of Kristen Smart is scheduled to continue until October 2022. For the Smart family, the emotional, decades-long search for the truth is finally coming to an end. However, the grief over the loss of their daughter will never end. On October 18, 2022, separate juries hearing the case simultaneously in Monterey County Circuit Court found Paul Flores guilty of first-degree murder and his father, Ruben Flores, not guilty of being an accessory after the fact. Ruben Flores faces a maximum sentence of 3 years in prison. Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison on March 10, 2023. Paul Flores is currently serving his sentence at Pleasant Valley State Prison. On August 23, 2023, Flores was attacked by fellow inmate Jason Boudreau, who was serving a life sentence for killing his girlfriend. Hello, crime enthusiasts. Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Jane Hilton. Jane was a familiar face in El Dorado Hills, California. She wrote for the Foothill Times and often reported on local social events. Jane had 6 children, whom she loved dearly and often inspired through her daily poetry. After earning her real estate license, she married Archie Hilton in 1984, but the marriage fell apart in July 1985. Seeking help, Jane approached her former boss, Will McLean, who owned a large house in El Dorado Hills. Will's daughter, Maureen Klein, lived there with her boyfriend. Will's nephew, Ricky Davis, and his girlfriend, Connie Dahl, were also staying in another room in the house. On July 6, 1985, Will invited Jane and his youngest daughter, Autumn Anker, to live in his house. Will's house was crowded and had a lot of people coming and going. However, Jane and Autumn's first night there would be their last. At 3:30 a.m., Ricky Davis, 20, and his girlfriend Connie Dahl, 19, returned from a party and found Autumn wandering around outside. Autumn said she had been attacked and feared her mother would be angry. The three of them then went inside, where they found traces of blood in the hallway. When they entered the first room, which belonged to Ricky's mother, Maureen, the air became quiet. On the bed, they found the bloody body of Jane Hilton. She had stopped breathing. Because Maureen and her boyfriend were away on a camping trip and were not home at the time, Ricky and Connie called 911. Paramedics and police arrived at the scene, but Jane was pronounced dead at the scene. She had been stabbed 29 times, beaten, and bitten on the shoulder. This senseless murder led investigators to begin questioning those closest to Jane. Archie Hilton, Jane's estranged husband, was at the top of the list of suspects. He was interviewed and provided a solid alibi, including DNA. Initially, Archie Hilton was the logical choice because their marriage was in trouble. However, he said that although they were having some difficulties, there was no sign that he and Jane were going to divorce. When Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl were interviewed, they both said that they came home early in the morning and found Autumn waiting outside. When they entered the house, they found the hallway carpet soaked in blood. The blood trail led them to the master bedroom, where they found Jane lying dead on the bloody mattress. The details and physical evidence in the case were scant, and the potential suspects all had alibis. The case gradually went cold. The cold case was reopened in 1999, and El Dorado County Sheriff's Department detectives Richard Strasser and Rick Fitzgerald were assigned to investigate. After a thorough review of the case file, they focused on a newspaper article about Connie Dahl, Ricky Davis's ex-girlfriend and Jane Hilton's roommate. In the article, Connie described the position of Jane's body when she was found, lying on the bed, as if someone had placed her in her usual sleeping position. However, this testimony contradicted Ricky Davis's earlier statement. Ricky had said on the recording that the body was found on the floor. But at the time, detectives thought they heard Ricky say that, but they weren't sure. Detectives questioned Connie for 3 hours. At first, she stuck to her story. But over the next 18 months, Connie was questioned 4 times. Each time, the detectives used techniques known to increase the likelihood of a false confession. They accused Connie of her role in the murder, and she was threatened with being charged with murder. As a result, Connie cooperated with the detectives, even though she had no actual role in the case. She was convicted of manslaughter and only served 1 year in prison. Detective Strasser and Fitzgerald lied to Connie, telling her that they would use DNA evidence to identify a suspect. In fact, no DNA evidence was collected or tested in this case. Instead, the investigators used crime scene photos and real events, such as the bite mark on Jane's shoulder, to provide information to Connie and guide her to recall events the way they wanted. Over the course of 4 interviews, Connie began to lose control and recall events from the case. However, this also allowed her to create a completely different story about the night of the murder, based on what she remembered and what investigators gave her. Connie Dahl gave conflicting accounts of Jane Hilton's murder. In one interview, she claimed that Autumn Anker was present at the crime scene and was shot. In another interview, she admitted that she may have bitten Jane's shoulder. Connie also claimed that the murder began with an argument between Ricky Davis and Jane, which stemmed from Ricky's desire for Autumn to join them at a party, which Jane refused. Despite changing her story to fit the facts, Connie could not recall the murder weapon or where it was hidden. However, she implicated her ex-boyfriend Ricky Davis in the case, making him the prime suspect. Following Connie's confession, detectives interviewed Ricky Davis and Autumn Anchor. Both stuck to their original accounts of the case. The detectives attempted to deceive Ricky by telling him that Autumn had also implicated him in the murder, but he did not change his story. Autumn told the detectives that she had no reason to protect Ricky and would not be swayed by threats of charges. Despite using coercive interrogation techniques, the detectives were unable to get Ricky or Autumn to change their statements. Therefore, they used Connie's confession to arrest Ricky. Connie accepted a plea bargain, agreeing to testify against Ricky in exchange for a reduced sentence. At Ricky's first trial, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, leading to a retrial. However, at his second trial in 2005, the jury found him guilty. During the trial, Connie took the stand and testified against Ricky. She explained that she had wrestled with Jane and accidentally bit her shoulder. Connie then walked out, leaving Ricky alone with Jane. Once outside, she heard Jane screaming, pleading, and gagging as Ricky continued to assault her. Ricky was sentenced to 16 years in prison for second-degree murder, largely based on Connie's testimony. Connie, on the other hand, received a reduced sentence of manslaughter and a 1-year sentence in county jail. Unfortunately, she died of a drug overdose in 2014. Despite his conviction, Ricky maintained his innocence. In 2006, he contacted the Northern California Innocence Project, NCIP, for help in proving his innocence. NCIP, a nonprofit founded in 2001 by Kathleen Rodolphi and Linda Starr, provides DNA testing services to convicted prisoners who claim innocence. Ricky's case was reopened in 2006 after he contacted NCIP. NCIP and the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office worked together to retest DNA from the crime scene. The retesting included Hilton's nightgown and biological material found under her fingernails. The retesting uncovered a DNA profile from an unidentified male. This DNA was found on both Hilton's fingernails and nightgown, indicating that they came from the same source. The results cleared Ricky, Connie, and Anchor of any crimes. This also proved that Connie's testimony was false. The DNA test results also proved Archie Hilton innocent, but unfortunately, he had passed away by the time the results were released. The unidentified DNA profile was entered into the FBI's CODIS database, but no matches were found. While the new evidence supports Ricky's claim of innocence, there are still obstacles to overcome. NCIP successfully argued that if the DNA test results had been presented at Ricky's trial, the outcome might have been different. In California, the standard for overturning a conviction typically requires new evidence that clearly establishes innocence. This standard is extremely difficult to meet. An expert on false confessions, Richard Leo, reviewed the transcript of Connie Dahl's interview in 2015. He found that detectives used pressure techniques to force Connie to give a false confession that fit the detectives' preconceived ideas about Jane Hilton's murder. Then, in 2016, the Northern California Innocence Project, NCIP, helped sponsor Senate Bill 1134, which was intended to address these issues. The bill allows wrongfully convicted people like Ricky to prove that new evidence could convince a jury. It was passed in January 2017, after NCIP attorney Melissa O'Connell filed a motion for a new trial based on new DNA evidence. The bill was sponsored by former California State Senator Mark Leno and brings California standards in line with those of 43 other states. In 2019, Superior Court Judge Kenneth Malakian overturned Ricky's 2005 conviction and ordered a new trial. It was originally scheduled to begin in the fall of 2019, but due to the health of his defense attorney, the judge announced the trial would take place in April 2020. However, the trial date changed again. Advances in DNA testing helped Ricky become the first person in California and only the second person in the United States to be exonerated of a crime. A new DNA testing method called genetic genealogy helped achieve this result. Genetic genealogy is a new DNA testing method that involves taking DNA evidence from the crime scene and sending it to genetic companies. These companies then search genealogical databases to find a potential match. In February 2020, the DNA evidence matched a man. In February 2020, El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson announced that a new suspect had been identified in the death of Jane Hilton. The man was identified through DNA evidence collected from the crime scene. Following his arrest, several residents who knew the man revealed his identity to the media. The man is known as Michael Green, a longtime resident of Roseville, California. Michael graduated from Oakmont High School in 1986. According to those who knew him, Michael was a nice and easygoing person. They even described him as very calm and cool. So, a former friend of Michael could not understand why he would commit such a brutal act in El Dorado Hills. Michael was 17 years old at the time of the crime. On the night of July 6, 1985, Jane Hilton's daughter Autumn met Michael and his two friends, Calvin and Stephen, at a park. Autumn then decided to go home to shower and said she would come back to see her friends. However, she went to another friend's house instead of going back to the park. However, that evening, Autumn returned to the park to meet the boys again. What happened next is only speculation. Investigators believe Michael took advantage of the moment to break into Jane's home and was discovered by her. In the struggle to escape, Michael may have attacked Jane in a frenzy. After the attack, Jane's body was discovered by Ricky, Connie, and Autumn when they returned home. Michael had no criminal record before or after the murder. Michael appeared to have lived a normal life until DNA linked him to the gruesome crime. Two other boys who were with Michael were sought shortly after his arrest. One boy, Calvin, had died some time ago. However, another boy, Stephen, was found and questioned the day after the arrest. Stephen is considered a witness, not a participant in the case. Michael was arrested on February 11, 2020. As Michael was a juvenile at the time of the murder, he made his first appearance in juvenile court on February 19, 2020. Michael was then transferred so that he could be tried as an adult. Michael waited 2.5 years before he was tried in court. On July 29, 2022, Michael pleaded no contest. This means that Michael waived his right to a jury trial, and he will face a charge of first-degree murder. He also waived his opportunity to object to the plea. His sentencing date was set for September 27, 2022, with Judge Suzanne Kingsbury presiding. During the sentencing hearing, Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, a professor of educational psychology, was called to testify about adolescent development. Kaufman's research shows that adolescents have a variety of developmental needs, including emotional and cognitive development. In late adolescence, young people can distinguish between right and wrong, but their ability to control their emotions declines. To provide additional information, the defense called several witnesses from Michael's childhood who had maintained relationships with him into adulthood. When asked about their views of Michael after learning of his confession, all agreed that they were shocked he had committed the murder of Jane Hilton. Those who knew Michael described him as cheerful, well-liked, funny, and lovable, both before and after the murder. Michael's ex-wife, Karen Green, said, "Mike was not evil at all." After the witnesses finished testifying, each of Jane Hilton's children gave victim impact statements. All described the unforgivable loss Michael had caused their family. Heather Purvis McConnell, Jane Hilton's daughter, said, "The pain that will never go away will always haunt me." Ardith Brandon, Hilton's fourth child, said, "I loved my mother and I think Michael loved her too." I want to know how he would feel or what he would say to the person who stabbed your mother 29 times. What would you do if you got a call in the early morning to tell you your mother was dead? Ardith recounted collecting her mother's belongings from the house where she was killed and ended with a powerful statement. We will always have something in common, regret for the stupid decision you made 37 years ago. Hilton's son, Ian, echoed his sister's sentiments. He went on to explain the hardships the family faced and the constant nightmares they endured, especially after being wrongly blamed for her sister Autumn. As he finished, he broke down in tears and said, "All the words we say will never bring my mother back." Autumn was the last to speak. Her testimony showed real pain as she recounted what she had been through over the past 2 decades. She recounted the day 2 detectives came to her home, telling her they had found the people responsible for her mother's death. She was later accused of biting her mother and helping move her body from the floor to the bed. Autumn said that if she had not sought the help of a lawyer at the time, she doesn't know how far the investigators' intimidation tactics could have gone. Deputy District Attorney Jay Linden read a statement on behalf of the family. In the statement, he questioned Michael about why he killed Jane in such a brutal manner. "You hit her. She had multiple injuries around her head and face. You kicked her in the jaw. You bit her shoulder. Why did you do that?" Linden went on to read a statement expressing that Michael did not just kill Jane, he destroyed many lives in the process. Linden then asked Michael if he thought about Jane and who she was. He pointed out her accomplishments and the love she had for each of her children. In her closing argument, Michael's defense attorney, Margaret Husher, emphasized that Michael was not in control of his actions. Margaret argued that Michael did not realize that his actions were wrong because he was a teenager at the time. This argument was based on expert testimony from Dr. Kaufman. She asked the court to consider a reduced sentence, reading various criminal codes and court rules. However, Judge Kingsbury interjected and stated that the court would not consider granting Michael probation, leaving the defense unable to add any further comment. In response, Linden thanked the court and said that the request for probation was an insult. He said it was like a slap in the face to the victim's family, who had suffered for decades. Linden stated that Michael had gotten away with murder for 37 years and that granting him probation would allow him to get away with more. Judge Kingsbury has heard many arguments about juvenile murder cases. In her 26 years as a judge, she said the murder of Jane Hilton was the most brutal. Before sentencing, Kingsbury asked the victim's family to forgive them for the pain they have endured. She also hoped they would overcome their pain, as that was their mother's wish. Kingsbury encouraged Michael Green to use all the resources available to him in the California Department of Rehabilitation. She said Michael could achieve parole if he used those resources. Kingsbury also said Michael had a great side and that he had a lot to offer. She also said he was young enough to be released and live a productive life. Michael Green was sentenced to life in prison and is being held in the El Dorado County Jail. He will then be transferred to the California Department of Rehabilitation. Restitution will be determined after further review by the court. Ricky Davis, who was wrongfully convicted of the murder, was released on February 13, 2020. He will be entitled to more than $750,000 in state compensation. However, his attorney argues that this amount does not make up for the years of freedom he has lost. Ricky continues to sue the state for damages covering the period from May 21, 2002 to February 13, 2020, for a whopping $18 million. The lawsuit is still pending as of 2022. In September 2022, California passed Assembly Bill 2644, which prohibits law enforcement officers from using threats, physical harm, deception, or manipulative interrogation tactics when interrogating people 17 years of age or younger. District Attorney Vern Pearson is calling on all law enforcement agencies to stop using intimidation tactics. He says the deceptive tactics that have been used for years will assume guilt and focus on getting a confession instead of getting the whole story. The El Dorado County DA's office will now dismiss any case where the main evidence is a confession obtained through threats, lies, or psychologically manipulative interrogation tactics. The measures are intended to ensure that no one is convicted based on a false, coerced confession like the one that Ricky Davis made. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Ronald Platt. July 28, 1996, began as a typical summer day in South England. Captain John Kopek and his son prepared for a fishing trip on their trawler, the Melkerry. Despite an unsuccessful day, they decided to try their luck in a spot known as the Roughs. They lowered the net into the water and waited. The two men felt a tug on the net, indicating that it was a large catch. However, when they pulled the net up, they were shocked to find that it was not a fish, but instead a badly decomposed body of a man. Captain Kopek immediately contacted the Brixham Coast Guard to report the discovery. The body was in a state of severe decomposition, indicating that it had been in the ocean for some time. Fish had nibbled at parts of the body, but despite the decomposition, the man's clothing was intact: a long-sleeved shirt, corduroy pants, and brown shoes. And there was no identification on the body. The only identifying features found on the dead man were a smudged tattoo on his right hand and a Rolex watch on his wrist. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office in Devon for further examination. It was estimated that the man was between 40 and 50 years old. A distinctive tattoo of a cluster of stars was found on his body. His only severe injury was a head wound, which was not fatal. This, combined with other bruising, suggested that he had been dragged along the seabed before being pulled into a boat. However, his lungs were filled with water, indicating that he had ultimately drowned. Police suspected that the man might have fallen overboard during a ferry crossing. The primary method for identifying him was through dental records, as they would be on file if he was a British citizen. However, this process would take some time. It was by chance that a mortuary technician noticed the man's watch, a Rolex Oyster self-winding model that was fully waterproof. The watch required regular motion to stay active and, as an original model, its ownership could potentially be traced. Police examined the watch found on the unidentified man and discovered a crucial clue. The calendar feature showed the date July 22nd, indicating that the man had likely drowned 2 days earlier, on July 20th, 1996. Further examination revealed a serial number hidden between the wristband and the watch face. Police sent this number to Rolex to verify its authenticity and determine who owned the watch. The mystery surrounding the man, now known as Rolex Man, gained further clues a few weeks later, after a record search identified the watch's owner as Ronald Joseph Platt. Ronald Joseph Platt was a 51-year-old TV repairman born in Calgary, Canada. His family later moved to Britain, where he grew up. Ronald remained unmarried and had served in the British Army as part of his national service. Those who knew him well described Ronald as a quiet and introverted man with a deep love for his native Canada. Ronald bought a Rolex watch in Germany in 1967, which became one of his most prized possessions. Ronald was so attached to the watch that, according to his former partners, he even wore it in the shower. Detective Constable Clenahan from the Devon and Cornwall Police was assigned to the case from the start. The police investigation revealed that Ronald's last known address was in Essex, which was hundreds of miles away from where his body was found. Clenahan contacted the Essex Police Department for assistance. Inspector Peter Redmond offered to visit the address to help with the investigation. When he visited the house, Peter found it vacant. Peter then contacted the owner and was told that the owner had moved out some time ago. However, Peter was provided with a letter of introduction that could assist in the investigation. The letter provided the address and contact details of a man named David Davis. Detective Peter called the number and got in touch with Davis. Before delivering the news, Peter asked Davis about his relationship with Ronald. Peter then informed Davis that a body had been found in Devon that was likely to be his friend. Davis agreed to meet with the police in Essex to discuss the matter further. When they met, Peter found Davis to be friendly and confident, but surprisingly calm, and asked very few questions about Ronald's death. Davis and Ronald had been friends for several years. Davis hadn't seen Ronald in over 3 months, and the last time they met, Davis had given him a loan to start an electrical business in France. Since then, Davis had assumed Ronald was living in France. During their conversation, Peter discovered that the symbol tattooed on Ronald's hand was a maple leaf, the national symbol of Canada. After providing all the necessary information, Davis left the station, assuring Detective Peter that he would send a photo of Ronald. The Essex police were then able to conclude their investigation, forming the theory that Ronald had fallen overboard and drowned in the channel. This theory aligned with Davis's account of the events, suggesting it was simply an unfortunate accident. With the Essex case over, Clenaghan had a problem on his end. He tried to contact Davis several times but was unsuccessful. Clenaghan then asked his colleague, Detective Peter of Essex, to help him contact Davis. Peter agreed and visited Davis at his home in Wooden Walter, a rural area of Essex with only 4 houses. They continued to describe Ronald to Peter, and he suddenly realized that the man they were describing was none other than the recently deceased Ronald Platt. This sudden revelation aroused Peter's suspicions, and he quickly contacted Clenaghan in Devon to share this surprising discovery. Police from both counties began to suspect that there was more to the case than initially appeared. Peter turned his attention to gathering information about the man impersonating his deceased friend. Peter visited an elderly couple, Frank and Aubrey, who shared with him the story of Ronald Platt, a young man with a wife and 2 young children. The couple mentioned that Ronald and his family frequently vacationed in Devon, where they owned a yacht, although they could not remember the name of the yacht. In Devon, Clenaghan reviewed the evidence and began reinterrogating old witnesses. His first was John Coppock, who revealed that when Ronald's body was found, a 10-pound anchor had also been pulled up in the net. John Coppock had given the anchor to a friend, who then passed it on to his mother to sell. Fortunately, the anchor had not yet been sold, allowing the police to retrieve it as evidence. Clenaghan's next step was to interview people who knew Ronald. He contacted Ronald's brother, Brian. Brian mentioned Elaine Boyes, Ronald's old friend of 13 years. Police then spoke with Elaine Boyes and discovered the connection between Ronald Platt and Davis. Elaine Boyes had met Davis in 1991 while working as a receptionist at a fine arts auction house in Harrogate, England. She recalled Davis as being tall, engaging, and charming. During their conversation, Davis mentioned his plans to move to Yorkshire, and the topic turned to job opportunities. Davis offered Elaine Boyes a job at his company, but she declined, explaining that she and Ronald were planning to move to Canada soon. Davis offered to help Elaine Boyes and Ronald save money to move to Canada. Elaine Boyes soon became Davis's executive assistant, and she soon introduced Ronald to Davis. The 2 men quickly became close friends. Elaine Boyes and Ronald were fascinated by Davis's lavish stories and impressed by his lavish lifestyle. Davis then offered them a business opportunity, proposing that they become directors of his company, the Cavendish Corporation. Although Elaine Boyes was initially hesitant, Davis explained that he wanted to keep a low profile due to his ex-wife, a wealthy doctor in New York, who allegedly still demanded alimony payments from him. By this point, Elaine Boyes and Ronald had developed a trust in Davis and believed that he was genuinely trying to protect her from his ex-wife. Davis sent both Elaine Boyes and Platt on business trips to Europe to negotiate deals on his behalf, gradually drawing them into his scheme. They transferred money to various offshore bank accounts without asking Davis what he intended to do with it, trusting him greatly because of his religious nature. On Christmas Day 1992, Davis invited Elaine Boyes and Ronald to visit Davis and his daughter, Noelle. After a sumptuous meal, they exchanged gifts. Elaine Boyes presented Davis with a card titled "The Greatest Gift Ever." In return, Davis gave the couple 2 plane tickets to Canada, provided they used them before February 1993. While Elaine Boyes was overwhelmed by the short notice, Ronald was overjoyed that his lifelong dream of returning to Canada had finally come true thanks to Davis. In preparation for their upcoming trip, Davis quickly made arrangements. To ensure he could effectively manage their affairs while they were away, he asked Elaine Boyes and Ronald to stamp their signatures and leave their driver's licenses with him in case they needed to prove their identity. Elaine Boyes and Ronald agreed, as they trusted Davis and were grateful for the new beginning he provided. Consequently, in February 1993, they left for Canada. However, the harsh winter conditions, lack of job opportunities, and resulting financial strain quickly put pressure on their relationship. Elaine Boyes and Ronald's relationship began to unravel due to increasing tension, ultimately causing them to drift apart. 5 months later, Elaine Boyes traveled to England to serve as a bridesmaid at her sister's wedding, with no intention of returning to Canada. Davis, who had become a family friend, was also invited to the wedding. During the event, he spoke with Elaine Boyes and asked about Ronald. Upon learning that Elaine Boyes had ended her relationship with Ronald and would not be returning to Canada, Davis was upset. He attempted to persuade Elaine Boyes to give Ronald another chance, but she refused. Davis packed up his life, said goodbye to Elaine Boyes, and left her with his mobile number. However, their friendship eventually dissolved, and the phone calls ceased. Ronald and Elaine Boyes had lost contact. Ever since Elaine Boyes moved away from Canada, she had not heard from Ronald, her former lover, or Davis, who had been her best friend. So when Davis suddenly contacted Elaine Boyes in late 1996, their conversation was somewhat awkward. They barely exchanged any important information, and surprisingly, Davis did not even mention Ronald's name. The conversation was brief, and they did not keep in touch after that. He failed to tell her that Ronald was dead. After the interview, Elaine Boyes suspected Davis was involved in Ronald's death. Police needed more concrete evidence. They started questioning witnesses. Following the wedding in Harrogate, Davis quickly moved to Devon with his family. There, he introduced himself as Ronald Platt. He also introduced his pregnant daughter as his wife, sometimes calling her Elaine Boyes. It was well known that Davis owned a yacht. Witnesses reported seeing Ronald and Davis together a month before Ronald's body was discovered. They claimed to have registered on Steam Packet as brothers, David and Ronald Platt. By this point, police knew Davis had lied about Ronald and his knowledge of Ronald's death. They needed one last piece of evidence to confirm their suspicions. Police analyzed mobile records and discovered that the calls made by Davis originated from the same area where the medical examiner believed Ronald had drowned. This led Essex police to plan a sting operation to arrest Davis on suspicion of Ronald's murder. The police were informed by Elaine Boyes that Davis had arranged to meet her for coffee at Chelmsford train station. The police arrived at the train station. However, Davis had escaped. Not giving up, Detective Peter decided to drive to the Davis family home. Pete called for backup. He speculated that Davis might be armed. As the police prepared to act, a taxi stopped at the entrance of the house, and Davis quickly escaped. The police promptly gave chase, and Davis was eventually caught and forced to surrender at gunpoint after Davis was arrested. Police took his fingerprints and submitted them to an international database. Albert Johnson Walker, a man on Interpol's wanted list and Canada's most wanted fugitive, was identified as the owner of the discovered prints. Albert Johnson's life story began in Canada. Born on August 9, 1945, in Hamilton, Ontario, Albert Johnson had big ambitions despite dropping out of high school. He had a charismatic presence. Albert Johnson met his ex-wife, Barbara MacDonald. They married in 1968. The couple started a family early and had 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys. Albert Johnson was born in Paris, Ontario, where he and his wife Barbara started a freelance accounting business. The business grew rapidly, and within a decade, it had expanded to 6 locations with more than 30 employees. However, Albert Johnson deceived his friends and clients by secretly transferring their investments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Over time, Albert Johnson's dishonesty wasn't the only problem he faced. His marriage began to fall apart due to his many affairs. Furthermore, those he had stolen money from began to become suspicious. With his empire on the brink of collapse, Albert Johnson decided to go on the run in 1990. Under the pretext of taking his 15-year-old daughter Sheena on a skiing trip to Europe, Albert Johnson escaped. Barbara discovered the incident and, concerned for her daughter's safety, reported her missing. The police tracked Albert Johnson to London, but lost track of him. Albert Johnson assumed a new identity, stolen from a client. He now went by the name Davis Wallace, and his daughter Sheena changed her name to Noel. Although he evaded the police, the name Davis linked him back to his real identity. Davis Wallace needed a new identity, and his opportunity came when he met Ronald Platt. Ronald had a strong interest in Canada. Davis used this information to his advantage and created a new identity for himself. However, his plans began to fall apart in 1995 when Ronald contacted him, saying that Ronald was frustrated with life in Canada and was moving back to Essex to be closer to Davis. This development posed a problem for Davis, as having 2 Ronald Platts with the same birth date in the same area would have raised suspicion. To solve this problem, Davis came up with a plan. He bought a yacht, the Lady Jane, and took his family and Ronald to Totnes and Devon to celebrate the launch. During this trip, Davis and Ronald purchased a new 10-pound anchor. Davis invited Ronald to Devon for the weekend to go fishing and enjoy the coast. Davis took Ronald to his boat, the Lady Jane, far enough from shore to avoid detection. Once alone, Davis hit Ronald over the head with the anchor, knocking him unconscious. Davis then searched Ronald's pockets for identification and retrieved it. Davis tied the anchor to Ronald's waist to weigh him down and threw him into the water, intending to make it look like an accident. However, Davis made the mistake of leaving Ronald's Rolex watch on his wrist, which was later used to foil the carefully planned crime and bring Davis to justice. Davis's trial began in 1998. During the trial, some key evidence was presented to the court. The anchor found in the net along with Ronald Platt's body. Forensic experts analyzed the wound on Ronald's head and determined that it matched the shape of the anchor. Further investigation found traces of zinc on Ronald's belt, which matched the zinc found on the anchor. It was discovered that the anchor had been attached to Ronald's belt to drown him in the sea. A search of the yacht, Lady Jane, also uncovered significant evidence. Hairs matching Ronald's were found on a cushion, and his fingerprint was discovered on the bag that had been used to carry the anchor back to the yacht. Additionally, blood was found near the rails, providing further evidence to the case. Davis's hoarding habits cost him, as documents were seized and used to prove his sham business ventures and his trail of deception. Elaine Boy's testimony provided evidence that Davis would lose a lot if Ronald Platt returned to England. And his daughter Sheena testified that Davis had been out on a yacht and looked disheveled and agitated when he returned later that day of the murder. Sheena also spoke candidly about life with Davis and how she was constantly harassed by her father and feared for her own safety. Supreme Court Justice Neil Butterfield said Davis was an extremely intelligent and ruthless individual who posed a threat to others. He stated that Davis's crimes were carefully planned and executed with precision. As a result, Davis was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. In 2005, he was allowed to move to Canada to serve his sentence. 2 years later, at the age of 61, Davis was given an additional 4-year sentence to be served concurrently. In 2015, Davis applied for parole but withdrew it at the last minute. Hi there, investigators. It's time to uncover the truth behind another case. The case of Frank Spencer. Frank Spencer was born on November 10, 1965, in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. His father was Cyrus, and his mother was Melina Spencer. Since childhood, Frank loved active games and sports, which helped him maintain a healthy body and mind. When he was in high school, he demonstrated his special ability on the wrestling team and was recognized as an excellent member. Frank had a strong ambition in business and wanted to continue the family business. So, after graduating from high school in 1984, he attended a local university and completed his course in 1988. After his father passed away, Frank became the owner of Spencer's Auto Parts. The year 1997 marked an important event in Frank's life. It was the year he met Maria. The two of them were attracted to each other at first sight. Maria was known for her hot temper and daring personality, which intrigued Frank. Frank's friend Paul remembered that Frank had always liked strong and wild people. And he was a bit like that too. When Frank and Maria met, they had a great start. However, not everyone was happy with the relationship. Maria's parents, in particular, had mixed opinions about Frank. They believed that Frank was not the right man for their daughter. Furthermore, there were rumors that Frank's father had been involved in a gang and was even a hired criminal. Maria's father did not have a good impression of Frank. He even tried to prevent their marriage for a while. Frank's family was also not happy with Frank's choice. So, Frank and Maria decided to run away and rent a separate apartment to get away from their families. After a while, Frank's family and Maria's family were forced to accept their relationship. Family life gradually returned to normal. Maria and Frank got married and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They then moved to a new house. During this time, Frank owned an auto parts business and sponsored race cars. He worked hard to provide his family with everything they needed. For Frank, his children were the top priority and driving force in his life. Maria initially tried to manage the housework and take care of the children. However, later, despite having a law degree, she became the coach of her daughter's soccer team. Her friends said that, unlike her husband, she was not really interested in the marriage. She seemed to be uninterested in work and family responsibilities. What worried her most was the financial issue. She liked to spend what Frank earned. Maria Spencer had a cold personality, especially towards the children. This caused many problems in her marriage. Her husband was frustrated with her selfishness and eccentricity and expected her to change when she became a mother. However, Maria remained her own person. In 2006, her husband decided to file for divorce because he could no longer stand her inappropriate behavior and constant scandals. He feared for the health of the children because of her unreasonable behavior. After the divorce, the relationship between the two became even more strained. A confrontation over custody was inevitable. Maria wanted to keep the children with her, but her husband did not trust her and believed that she could not take good care of them. However, not everyone agreed with her husband's views. For example, her husband's friend, Ron, believed that both parents were necessary for the children to develop normally. Frank's friend advised him to negotiate with Maria for custody of the children. However, Frank thought he knew better than his friends and continued to demand sole custody. Maria did the same. She also hoped to receive a substantial amount of child support. The conflict between Frank and Maria worsened over time. On several occasions, due to Maria's erratic behavior, Frank had to call the police for help. Maria repeatedly attacked Frank and the children, but not everyone believed this. In 2008, an incident occurred that confirmed Frank's accusations. After a fight with Maria near their children's school, Maria was arrested. The problem stemmed from Maria wanting to pick up her daughter. But Frank's relatives prevented her. The reason was that the two had made another agreement, but Maria changed her mind at the last minute. After the fight, Maria put the child in the car but forgot to fasten the seatbelt. When the police checked her car, they discovered that Maria's actions could endanger the life and health of the child. As a result, Maria got into trouble with the law. She was charged with disorderly conduct and child endangerment. In addition, Frank also accused Maria of stalking him, claiming that she had stalked him on multiple occasions. For this reason, Maria faced an additional charge. Maria could not be convicted of endangering the life of the child because the prosecution could not prove it. Therefore, the authorities decided to drop the charge in exchange for Maria's admission of guilt for disorderly conduct and stalking. Maria agreed and was fined $600. However, this event did not make Maria reconsider her behavior. Instead, she continued to act negatively. Frank's acquaintances and relatives increasingly heard complaints from him about Maria threatening and stalking him. Some of Maria's co-workers also said that she repeatedly mentioned that she hated Frank and was willing to harm him. For this reason, one of her co-workers nicknamed her Black Widow. Frank tried to stay calm and smooth over the rough edges, but Maria wouldn't stop. He kept trying to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. Frank started recording every conflict so that he would have evidence in case something bad happened. He just wanted to live and work in peace, but Maria took it too far. In 2009, Frank tried to stay positive and eventually met a woman named Julie. However, Maria soon learned about his new relationship. According to Maria, she didn't care that Frank was dating Julie, but what bothered her was that Frank gave Julie access to the children. However, Frank thought that Maria was extremely jealous, and that was the cause of all the trouble. Maria then became very angry. In February 2009, she sent a voice message to Julie, warning her not to go near the children. However, the situation worsened when Maria's father was released from prison after serving 5 years for fraud. His reputation was already bad, and for Frank, this meant more trouble, as he knew Maria's father had a fierce temper. Many believe that Maria had inherited her fierce personality from her father. As Frank became pensive and anxious, his colleagues noticed it too. The first incident that happened after Maria's father Anthony was released was a robbery at Frank's office. Important documents that could affect Frank's divorce were stolen. The next day, Maria called Frank and hinted that she had found something interesting. Frank understood that she was referring to the stolen documents and advised her to return them. At the same time, he also reported the incident to the police. However, it was unsuccessful in proving that someone was involved in the incident. The detectives did not find any traces of the perpetrator. However, everyone suspected that Maria and her father were involved in the crime. The police also considered Maria a suspect. In the end, the investigation of the case was stopped. However, thanks to the intervention of the police, Maria returned the stolen documents to the owner. It is likely that these documents did not contain any important information that could be used in court. The situation between Frank and Maria continued to escalate. Frank's patience was at its limit after Maria repeatedly threatened him on social media. This was because Frank's children were still in contact with his new partner, Julie. Julie, on the other hand, remained calm and balanced, enjoying her time with Frank and his children. She tried not to interfere in Frank and Maria's complicated relationship. However, Frank was extremely angry that Maria had neglected her parental responsibilities. The arguments between the two continued until 2010. At that point, Frank sought the intervention of law enforcement. He asked the police to evaluate Maria's behavior. Despite the threats, Maria insisted that it was just her way of communicating and that she meant nothing reprehensible. Again, Maria's guilt could not be proven because her warnings were vague. In January 2010, a fire brought negativity to Frank. In a strange coincidence, before a romantic trip to the Caribbean islands that he had planned, a fire broke out at Frank's mother's house the night before the trip. Fortunately, no one was injured, but all the property was destroyed by fire and smoke. During this fire, witnesses reported seeing a car driven by Maria, accompanied by neighbors and friends, visiting the house at that time. Maria smiled and watched the fire before leaving. After the fire department put out the fire, a dog owned by one of Frank's children was found dead in the fire. Maria's actions crossed the line, forcing the police to investigate the incident. Unfortunately, there was no clear evidence of arson at the time, and the fire was ruled an accident. Maria then sent Frank a frantic text message, gloating about how karma had caught up with him and how her life had been ruined. She hinted that Frank could face more consequences in the future. Maria also began sending similar messages to Julie, Frank's new partner. When the police failed to act, Maria's aggression escalated. She became so dangerous that she openly threatened Frank and Julie. A few months later, a fire broke out at Julie's house. This time, the situation could have been much worse. Julie was home when the fire broke out, but she was lucky to escape by jumping off the porch. Although she was uninjured, her house was severely damaged and uninhabitable. As a result, Frank invited Julie to move in with him. Frank and Julie feared that this would only make Maria angrier, but they had no other choice. The police are investigating the exact cause of the fire. A similar situation in the past suggests that the fire may have been intentionally set by an individual. Frank and Julie live in a different district than the burned street, so they hope that the police will conduct a fair and impartial investigation. However, once again, there is not much they can do due to the lack of concrete evidence. However, the investigators did not give up. Julie hired private investigators to join the investigation, which pushed the inquiry in a new direction. During the inspection, 2 flares were found on the lawn. One was broken and lying nearby. Investigators also discovered that the fire had spread from the steps leading to the balcony of the house. Finally, after collecting and examining the data, experts determined that the cause of the fire was arson. However, the lack of direct evidence has prevented authorities from identifying the perpetrators. The suspects remain at large and have not been prosecuted for their crimes. The cold summer of 2012 marked a tragic event in the life of the Frank family. In June 2012, Frank and Julie decided to split up, but in reality, it was just a plan to distract Maria. However, this also marked the final farewell of the Frank family. Just a few weeks later, Frank was found dead. On July 3, Joe, a close friend of Frank's, decided to visit him because he had not heard from him for a while. Joe and Frank used to take their children out together, and their team was currently in an important series of matches. However, when Frank did not answer the phone, Joe decided to visit him in person. When he arrived at Frank's house, Joe became worried when he saw that the front door was slightly ajar and there were stains near it. His fear was confirmed when he entered the house and saw Frank lying motionless on the floor. Frank's face was serene, as if he had finally found the peace he had been looking for. However, when Joe walked around the body, he saw dried blood in Frank's ear. Without hesitation, Joe called emergency services. As news of the incident spread throughout the county, everyone knew that this was a terrible crime. However, the detectives had to take matters into their own hands to find out who was behind this murder. Investigators discovered many important signs at the crime scene. They found large pools of blood and drag marks on the floor, along with a clear shoe print and bloody gloves in the kitchen. This physical evidence was sent for analysis. The investigation results showed that the bloody shoe print matched the size of the gloves that Maria's father, Anthony, often wore. Furthermore, Maria's DNA was found on the gloves. Since Maria had not lived with the family for over a year, the presence of her DNA on the gloves was unlikely to have happened by accident. All the evidence pointed to the involvement of Anthony and Maria in the case. Both were subsequently arrested. Autopsy results and ballistics analysis revealed that Frank had been shot with two different weapons. The first bullet was fired from a .30 caliber sniper rifle as he stood by the front door. Forensic experts found a sniper nest about 115 feet from the house. The bullet went through Frank's arm and chest, causing severe and fatal injuries. The attackers dragged Frank into the house, where they fired a final shot into his head with a .357 Magnum revolver. Frank was already dead at that point. This action was considered an act of revenge, suggesting that the shooter harbored a grudge against the victim. Police speculated that Anthony shot Frank with the rifle. There were also some important clues left behind. Frank's car and dog were missing from the house, implicating Anthony and Maria. A review of traffic cameras showed Frank's car driving away from the victim's house shortly after the crime. However, the driver could not be identified. The car was later found in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, 27 miles from Frank's house and 5 miles from Maria's residence. However, no fingerprints or other evidence were found inside the car. Frank's dog was found 2 days after the crime when it wandered into a wedding in Dauphin. Thanks to an electronic chip, attendees realized that the dog had an owner. The dog was later returned to Frank's mother. The fact that Frank had purchased the dog after the fire helped shed some light on the case. During the investigation, detectives discovered that the criminals had taken the dog as they were fleeing the scene. During the time Anthony was stopped, the dog was attracted to the smell of food nearby and escaped. It then wandered into a house where a wedding was being held, where it was found. This helped detectives prove that Anthony's phone was near the venue of the celebration on the day of the crime, even though he claimed to be at home in Harrisburg, 12 miles away. It is possible that Maria was the one who put the dog in the car, but this decision proved to be a mistake. During questioning, Anthony admitted that Frank had asked him for help several times and that he had visited Frank the day before Frank died. This would explain the traces found at the crime scene. However, Anthony could not explain the presence of the pool of blood. His testimony sounded disingenuous. Anthony also confessed that Frank had given him the car to use that same day, apparently to justify his fingerprints at the victim's house. This would indicate that he had been at the crime scene the day before. Searches were conducted at Anthony and Maria's homes to find the murder weapon, but Anthony was a seasoned criminal and knew how to handle weapons. Therefore, neither the rifle nor the pistol was found. Maria also refused to admit her guilt. She assumed that the glove had been accidentally sent to her ex-husband's house, possibly because the children had moved it one day. Eventually, Anthony and Maria were released to go home. However, detectives continued to investigate and collect the evidence needed to solve the case. Meanwhile, Frank's friend Derek Reed tried to talk to Maria at a school football game. During the conversation, Maria confessed that the last thing her husband saw before he died was her face. This statement was strange and curious. The investigation into Frank's death received intense attention from the state attorney general. The attorney general was furious with the indifference of the authorities to Frank's reports and statements. The police also faced numerous complaints of incompetence, and an internal investigation was inevitable. However, the police's negligence in their duties could not be proven. The reason was that much of the information provided by Frank, which the police believed lacked solid evidence, contributed to Frank's tragic death. The public and Frank's relatives were outraged that their petition had not yielded results. Meanwhile, investigators tried to prove the suspect's guilt not only in the crime but also in stalking and other crimes committed before. In 2013, a major interrogation was held. At the same time, Maria and Anthony continued to claim their innocence, denying all 12 charges against them. Their unwillingness to cooperate with the investigation led to charges of providing false testimony. Prosecutors argued that the suspects had arrived at Frank's home together, but they chose not to use their own vehicles to avoid attracting attention. Instead, they fled the scene in Frank's car. By the end of 2014, Maria was recaptured. Meanwhile, Anthony successfully escaped. After being interrogated one last time, Anthony boarded a plane and flew to Colombia. According to the investigation, Anthony's escape was evidence that he was hiding his guilt. For 11 months, Anthony was on the run but was eventually captured in Buenos Aires, Argentina. After being arrested by local police, he fought extradition to the United States but was unsuccessful and was deported back to his home country. In the fall of 2015, Maria's trial began. She continued to deny her guilt and blamed her father. She claimed that she loved Frank and never wanted him dead. However, multiple witnesses came forward to shed light on her true nature, recounting the threats, stalking, and sabotage she had committed. After more than a week of trial, the jury returned a verdict, finding her guilty on all counts, including murder, arson, burglary, perjury, conspiracy, and menacing. Maria was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 50 years. Witnesses reported that she smiled throughout the trial. Years later, Anthony's trial began. Anthony was furious when he heard his daughter's accusations. He claimed he was only helping her but objected to the use of violence. However, the physical evidence suggested otherwise. Finally, in the fall of 2018, Anthony was convicted of murder, robbery, and arson. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 45 years. When he was sentenced, the 77-year-old blew a kiss to the prosecutor and the lead detective before cursing at the judge. Years later, Anthony sought to appeal, claiming his defense attorney was ineffective, which led to his conviction. His daughter, Maria, also tried to appeal her case. However, both Maria and Anthony efforts were unsuccessful. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Nancy Lagerquist. Nancy Lagerquist, an 87-year-old woman, was a resident at the Riverside Healthcare Center, where she had lived since 1988. She was born in 1902 in Hamilton, Montana, and she spent much of her life working as an executive secretary. She was also an active member of the Missoula Business and Professional Women's Club before her retirement. She remained single for her entire life and did not have any children. When she passed away, she also did not have many relatives. On July 1, 1990, Nancy was seen sleeping in her bed by a care worker at 3:30 a.m. 1 hour later, at 4:30 a.m., the care worker checked on her room again but found her missing. This caused alarm and prompted 5 staff members on the shift to conduct a search. Despite their efforts, Nancy was nowhere to be found. At 4:41 a.m., the police were notified about her disappearance. It is worth noting that Nancy required around-the-clock assistance as she was unable to walk. Before her disappearance, she had been living an ordinary life at the care home, with nothing in her background suggesting she was at risk. Law enforcement and search and rescue teams arrived quickly at the scene. They searched the home and the surrounding area thoroughly. Since the home was located along the Clark Fork River, police officers in boats also searched the water. At 6:30 a.m., they stopped searching. Authorities found Nancy's body near the riverbank, about 30 minutes downstream from Riverside. She was the victim of a brutal murder involving sexual assault. Afterward, her body was thrown into the water. Two investigators working on the case quickly realized the enormity of the challenge ahead. The discovery of Nancy's body in the water resulted in the destruction of any forensic evidence. Additionally, several key pieces of evidence, including Nancy's missing diaper and the possible murder weapon, were never found, leaving the police with unanswered questions. Detectives theorized that the perpetrator entered and exited Nancy's room through the window facing the river. To do this, they cut the window screen, but left no evidence on the window, windowsill, or anywhere else in the room. It is also puzzling that none of the home's alarm systems were triggered during the entry, and further checks revealed that all alarms were working properly at the time. A key witness reported seeing a man near the crime scene around 4 a.m. He walked through the parking lot of the Missoula Athletic Club, moving away from the river toward East Broadway Street. This individual was approximately 30 to 40 years old, 180 to 200 pounds, and had distinct physical features, including light brown collar-length hair, a mustache, and brown-rimmed glasses. He wore an untucked, striped white and brown t-shirt, which was longer at the back, along with tan shorts and white tennis shoes. The man was not considered a suspect in the case, but the police did want to question him. Nancy had very few relatives, so investigators quickly dismissed a family-related motive for the murder. They shifted their focus to the care home staff. Considering that a staff member would be familiar with the layout and security measures of the facility, leading them to suspect that the murder could be an inside job. This led authorities to concentrate on a particular male staff member. He was eventually cleared, but he left the care home less than a month later for unclear reasons. The police investigation shifted from focusing on a staff member to the possibility of an outside perpetrator. They observed that the home's security measures concentrated on the doors rather than the windows, leading them to speculate that the victim, Nancy, might have been targeted simply because her room faced the river, with no specific motive for the attack. During the investigation, a man named James Bailey was interviewed multiple times, but was eventually cleared as a suspect. Detectives have been reviewing witness statements to look for any other suspicious deaths at the nursing home. Their attention was drawn to the case of 86-year-old Bertha Scott, an Alzheimer's patient who passed away in her bed on May 2, 1990. At the time, her death was attributed to natural causes, as she had heart disease and was frequently restrained at night to prevent her from wandering. However, one nurse reported an unusual detail, a bruise on Bertha's neck, which they found suspicious. Bertha died and was buried without an autopsy being performed. Around the time of her death, staff members at her care home noticed some minor tampering with the windows in the physical therapy room. Based on a nurse's comments, the police decided to exhume Bertha's body to re-examine her cause of death. The police later revealed to her family that she had been raped, then she being strangled to death, leaving them in shock. Bertha's life is very different from Nancy's. Born in Pennsylvania in 1904, and Bertha married 20 years later. 2 years before her death, she moved to Missoula to be closer to her children. Although 4 of her 6 children had passed away before her, she left behind numerous grandchildren. During the medical examination of Bertha's body, semen was found, and the sample was collected. Unfortunately, the sample was too degraded to produce a DNA profile, therefore was unable to help the police identify her killer. Both cases eventually came to a dead end. In 1992, authorities investigated a suspect who was guilty of sexually assaulting a nursing home resident, but he had an alibi since he was in prison during the murders. The same year, Lloyd Chase Allen was also identified as a suspect, but he too was incarcerated at the time. In 2002, the Missoulian reported that several residents of the care home described a mysterious man who would walk the halls at night. There are concerns about the accuracy of the information provided by these residents, so it's difficult to determine whether this man actually existed. As a result, it is that additional unsolved cases exist. Without DNA evidence or further investigation, a resolution to this case seems unlikely. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Kera Stops Pretty Places. Kera Stops Pretty Places was born on August 14, 2001. She grew up in a large family and was a member of the Crow and North Cheyenne Native American reservations in Montana. As a teenager, she was an exceptional athlete, enjoying various sports including basketball, football, running, cross-country, and wrestling. She also had a passion for the arts, performing in plays and singing in her high school choir at Hardin High School. Kera is a kind and compassionate person, always caring and understanding to those she comes into contact with. In her free time, she often cared for stray animals. Her lifelong dream was to become a performer, aspiring to act and sing, with a bright future ahead of her. However, her life was tragically cut short shortly after she turned 18. Kera was last seen in the rural town of Hardin, near the Crow Reservation, on August 24, 2019. She lives with her grandmother, who is named Yolanda Frazier. People did not know where she went, but it was clear that she did not return home. Kera planned to meet her mother the following day for a trip to North Dakota but failed to appear. Her family began to worry when Kera, no responding to texts, didn't answer calls, and was inactive on social media. This was unusual for her, raising concerns that something was amiss. Kera's aunt, Priscilla Bulltail, went to the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office to report Kera's niece missing. However, the office told her that she would have to wait a while before filing a report. This information proved to be false. In Montana, because Kera was under 21 and considered a minor, police were required to conduct an immediate search. Despite this, it wasn't until August 27 that the missing persons report was finally allowed to be filed by Kera's family. Kera's family felt that the police did not take her disappearance seriously, they failing to conduct a search and failing to distribute flyers after she went missing. When she went missing, police initially told Priscilla that Kera was probably just out with friends. Kera had previously struggled with alcohol issues, most notably when she was found unresponsive at school in 2019 due to intoxication and required emergency medical help. After her disappearance, her family waited anxiously for any information about her whereabouts. It wasn't until 5 days later, on August 29, that a jogger stumbled upon Kera's body near a wood pile in a backyard at the intersection of Mitchell Avenue and Rangeview Drive in the Hardin suburb, the same area where she was last seen alive. Notably, the homeowner, who had no connection to Kera, was away at the time of the discovery. Kera's family was not immediately notified that a body had been found, and instead, they learned about the information through social media rumors. As the news spread, they became extremely concerned. Priscilla attempted to visit the scene to identify the body, but was denied access and she couldn't tell if it was Kera or not. Local news outlets were also not alerted to the discovery of the body. Kera's mother and Yolanda visited the local mortuary on September 1 to identify a body, but they were initially told it was not Kera's. As a result, the family continued their search for her. It wasn't until 10 days later that the body was confirmed to be Kera's. The coroner concluded that she died on August 26 and that her death was suspicious, requiring further investigation. However, due to the advanced decomposition of her remains, the exact cause of her death could not be determined. It was also not possible to rule out asphyxiation as a cause of death. Following Kera's body discovery, her family urged law enforcement to investigate her death. However, the family soon encountered resistance from Terry Bullis, the county coroner and owned the local funeral home Bullis Mortuary. Terry informed Kera's mother, Geraldine, on September 12 that her daughter's remains would have to be cremated in order for them to be returned to the family. This went against the family's cultural beliefs and also meant that no further examinations of the body would be possible. Moreover, the family had chosen the Dahl Funeral Home to handle the funeral arrangements, but Terry forced them to use his business, Bullis Mortuary Funeral Home. To the family's dismay, Kera was cremated before her other relatives could even arrive in Hilton. On September 14, the family located the site where Kera's body was discovered with the help of nearby relatives. A few days earlier, they had tried to visit the area, but were unable to, as the scene was no longer cordoned off and there were no boundaries to where the body was discovered. They met Jason Cummings, the neighbor who had found Kera's body. He told them that he had suggested to the police to charge her phone so they could contact the family. Unfortunately, it seemed the police had ignored his suggestion. Jason also questioned the authorities for not sealing off the crime scene, causing evidence to be destroyed. 5 days after Kera went missing, on September 19, her family contacted the media to raise awareness about the case. However, they were surprised to discover that local news outlets, including the Billings Gazette, were unaware of the situation. The Gazette said it called the sheriff's office daily for updates on the cases, but they were not notified about Kera's case. On the same day, Kera's mother, Geraldine, along with Kera's father, Alan, met with Captain Mike Fuss from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office. They questioned Captain Fuss about why he had not contacted them or returned their calls. Captain Mike explained that he had been preoccupied with other cases. When asked why the crime scene had not been sealed off, Captain Mike stated that according to protocol, if investigators arrived at the scene before uniformed officers, sealing off the scene was not necessary. However, if officers arrived first, the scene would be sealed off. Geraldine and Alan also inquired about Kera's phone, asking why law enforcement had not charged it to examine her recent communications. Captain Mike seemed surprised that the family knew about this detail and explained that the battery was dead, so they did not attempt to use it. However, Kera's family countered that the authorities could have charged the phone to access for recent activity. They initially claimed that not even the FBI could gain access to the phone's contents. Captain Mike reported that Kera had apparently died from alcohol poisoning. However, her family's offer of a $5,000 reward for any information about her death. Mike's response was unexpected and surprising, revealing a clear expression of anger. Additionally, Mike revealed that the original investigator, Jeremy Middlestead, had resigned from the case, citing that he couldn't handle it. A number of new developments occurred during this time. Kera's family was interviewed by law enforcement for the first time, and they also met with the Bighorn County Attorney, Jay Harris. Jay disclosed that the coroner, Terry Bullis, had a potential conflict of interest due to his roles as the owner of a funeral home business and the county medical examiner. Jay noted that under Terry's leadership, many deaths had been rapidly attributed to exposure to alcohol and natural causes. However, when the family sought answers to their questions, Jay was short-tempered and provided little clarity. On the 23rd, Kera's family received notice that her missing person report had not been filed and that her name was not in the missing persons database. A week later, the FBI declined to take the case, stating they required more evidence that Kera was murdered on the reservation. Notably, shortly before Kera's disappearance, she recorded a video of her 15-year-old wheelchair-bound younger brother being beaten by several police officers and shared it on social media. The incident involved deputies from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, resulting in disciplinary actions against the officers involved. However, one of the policemen present at the scene where Kera's body was found was said to be a policeman involved in the beating. This has raised suspicions that the police involved in Kera's death chose not to investigate, possibly to retaliate against her for her attempts to hold them responsible for her actions. 2 years after Kera's death, new information surfaced in August 2021. 4 witnesses came forward with accounts of the incident that led to her death. Their statements are not entirely consistent, but they generally agree on what happened. The witnesses reported that an argument took place outside a house on Rangeview Drive around 3 a.m. on August 26, 2019. Kera was involved in the argument with 3 other individuals, a 17-year-old girl, a 19-year-old woman, and a 23-year-old man. It was claimed that Kera had been at the house earlier, and one of the occupants had bought her alcohol. At the time of her death, her blood alcohol level was 0.149. The argument prompted a nearby resident to set off their car alarm, hoping the noise would cause the group to leave. And the group dispersed in different directions. Kera was last seen heading towards the area where her body was later found. Additional information was also revealed in the new report. Forensic analysis found no foreign DNA under Kera's fingernails. Furthermore, it was discovered that Kera had been diagnosed with asthma shortly before her disappearance. The case remains unsolved, and the authorities are still seeking information. Hello again, true crime fans, we've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Amy Weidner. Amy Weidner, born in 1973, is the second of 4 children. Her siblings include an older brother, John Paul, and 2 younger sisters, Tiny and Cassie, who are 1 and 4 years younger than Amy. After their parents divorced, Gloria, the children's mother, took on the responsibility of raising the children herself. As their father played no role in raising them, the family lived in a house in Indianapolis, with Amy helping her mother with various household chores, including cooking, cleaning, and caring for her younger sisters. Amy, a bright and cheerful 14-year-old girl, had big dreams of becoming a teacher. However, her life took an unexpected turn when she became pregnant. Afraid to tell her mother, she hid her pregnancy by wearing baggy clothes for over 5 months. As her belly grew, it became harder to hide it, and eventually, her family discovered her secret when she was nearly 6 months pregnant. Gathering all her courage, Amy told her mother, Gloria, and burst into tears. Amy begged her mother not to hate her, but Gloria, though shocked, offered words of comfort and encouragement. Gloria recalls feeling stunned, thinking that this was the worst thing that could happen in her life. However, she had no idea of the even more heartbreaking events that were about to happen. The father of Amy's child was 20-year-old Tony Abercrombie, a friend of her brother. What their family did not know was that Amy and Tony had a secret relationship, with only the 2 of them knowing about their intimacy. After learning of her daughter's pregnancy, Gloria took control and forbade Amy from seeing Tony. On October 25, 1987, Amy gave birth to a daughter named Emily. Amy started school again just 6 days after giving birth. Her mother, Gloria, strongly supported Amy's return to school by taking care of Emily, allowing Amy to focus on her studies. Gloria also made sure that Amy had time to socialize with friends and live a normal teenage life. As a new mother, Amy remained dedicated to her studies, impressing her teachers with her perseverance. Despite juggling the demands of motherhood, Amy excelled in her studies, continuing to receive praise from her teachers. Amy's family adapted to the new addition, with everyone sharing the care of Emily. Over time, life began to fall into a positive pattern, with Amy overcoming her difficulties. Just when things seemed to be going smoothly, a sudden change turned everything upside down. On November 13, 1989, 16-year-old Amy woke up with a severe sore throat and decided to stay home from school, despite her mother, Gloria, offering to take Emily to a nanny. She kept her 2-year-old daughter, Emily, with her. After breakfast together, Gloria went to work, and Amy's siblings went to school, leaving Amy and Emily alone at home. Gloria tried to contact Amy by phone at 9:30 a.m. but received no response. When she called again a few hours later and still had not heard anything, Gloria became worried. She asked a nearby neighbor to stop by and check on them. The neighbor found the house quiet and unresponsive, prompting Gloria to leave work immediately and go home. When she arrived, she found Emily sitting on the stairs. Gloria called Amy, but received no answer, so she went upstairs. The scene in Amy's bedroom was tragic and shocking. Amy lay motionless and naked on the bed, surrounded by bloodstains. When Gloria realized the urgency of the situation, she quickly called 911. The police arrived and carefully searched Amy's house. At first, they thought someone had tried to break in because several items were missing, including stereo equipment and a graphic equalizer that belonged to Amy's brother, John Paul. Another item missing was a piggy bank from Amy's room, a simple glass jar with about $50 in savings for school. The police did not find any signs of forced entry. It is likely that the perpetrator entered through an unlocked back door or the front door, which Amy may have opened herself. In Amy's room, the police found key evidence, a bloody handprint on the wall and several strands of hair, likely belonging to the attacker. The medical examiner determined that Amy had been hit in the head with a sharp object, sexually assaulted, and then strangled. Amy's 2-year-old daughter, Emily, may have witnessed these events. Fortunately, Emily was found unharmed. Due to Emily's young age, the police attempted to communicate with her and gather any information she had. To create a more comfortable environment, they used finger puppets to gently question Emily about the events. During the interaction, Emily mentioned that her mother seemed very angry that day. Unfortunately, Emily did not provide any further details. To aid in their investigation, the police collected evidence, including a section of the wall with the attacker's bloody handprint, as well as the victim's clothing and bedding at the crime scene. During the investigation of Amy's case, the police spoke to her family, friends, and neighbors to gather information. One of the people they interviewed was Amy's 17-year-old brother, John Paul. Police initially suspected him, but he had an alibi and no evidence linking him to the case. Another person of interest was Tony Abercrombie, Amy's ex-boyfriend and the father of her child. He denied any involvement in her murder and expressed his deep feelings for Amy. Tony had a credible alibi at the time of the murder. Police also investigated Troy Jackson, who lived next door to Amy. Although he claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, he knew that a stereo system had been stolen on the day of the murder. Troy had no bruises or scratches on his hands, and a hair sample did not match the hair found at the crime scene. Troy also passed a lie detector test, which eventually cleared him as a suspect. Police expanded their investigation by talking to other acquaintances, neighbors, and classmates of Amy. They collected fingerprints and hair samples from these people, but no evidence pointed to any of them. A large crowd attended Amy Weidner's funeral, and police attended the funeral, observing the proceedings and looking for potential clues in the case. Months passed after Amy's death, and the police still had no leads on any suspects. Gloria Weidner, Amy's mother, adopted her niece Emily. As the family grieved their loss, Gloria feared for their safety, as the killer had not been caught. Fearing for her children's safety, she considered moving to a new home, but financial constraints made this impossible, forcing them to face their fears in their current home. Amy's friends were now haunted by the fear that they might be the attacker's next target. To feel safer, many of them asked their parents to take precautions and improve the security of their homes. Some even went so far as to board up their windows to protect against potential attacks. One day, when Gloria returned home after a normal day, she expected to find her daughters home from school. However, she was met with an eerie silence when she entered the house. The house was eerily empty, but her daughter's shoes were in their usual place near the door. Horrifying thoughts filled Gloria's mind as she climbed the stairs, fearing another disaster. She stood frozen in her bedroom doorway. Gloria took a deep breath and pushed the door open, finding her children simply asleep, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Occasionally, the police would visit Amy's family, inadvertently forcing them to relive the pain of that terrible day. The constant reminders of the past eventually became unbearable for Gloria. All she wanted was for the police to leave her family alone and stop stirring up memories that would never bring Amy back. In 1989, Amy was murdered and the case went cold. 13 years later, a shocking development occurred when a 29-year-old man contacted the Indianapolis Police Department claiming that he had had a dream in which Amy provided information about her death. Although he provided details about the murder, most of the information was released in news reports. Police investigated the man, who was 16 at the time of the incident and lived across the street from Amy's house. His fingerprints and DNA were tested for any potential connection, but no match was found, leading to his release. Although his call did not contribute significant evidence, it prompted police to re-examine the unsolved case. In 2002, the investigation resumed, focusing on some of Amy's friends and acquaintances. Despite renewed efforts, the investigation once again hit a dead end, leaving the case unsolved. 8 years later, a Facebook group called Remembering Amy was created by her friends, sparking renewed interest in solving the case. A police officer, unfamiliar with Facebook, asked his colleague, Officer Bill Carter, to help him print out information from a Facebook group related to a cold case. Although Bill specializes in crimes other than homicide, reviewing the details of the case piqued his interest in Amy's murder. In his spare time, he began to explore the case files. Bill scrutinized the 2-decade-old case, re-examining every detail in the file, re-evaluating the evidence, and reviewing Amy's school records from the day of the murder. He also looked at the list of people who had attended Amy's funeral. By entering the case information into the database, Bill found some overlooked leads. Among them were several friends of Amy's brother who had never been questioned by the police and had not provided DNA samples. In 2011, Officer Bill expanded his investigation by contacting Amy's family and friends, asking for potential leads and the names of people who might have information about the case. As part of his new approach, he also began collecting DNA samples from people who had not previously been considered during the initial investigation. This effort complemented the neighborhood survey conducted after the crime, where police recorded the names of residents who lived near Amy's home. Bill reviewed the case file and returned to the area to determine if any of the original residents still lived nearby. His investigation led him to a woman who was a neighbor and friend of Amy's. The woman tried to recall the names of the boys Amy had befriended, and while she mentioned some names that the police knew, she also mentioned an unfamiliar name, Rodney Dank. In 2012, Bill received permission from the Cold Case Unit to officially take over the Amy case. His first step was to locate Rodney Dank to determine if he was a potential suspect. Amy's family was familiar with Rodney, as he was friends with Amy's brother, John Paul. They spent time together doing activities like biking and fishing. Bill asked John Paul about Rodney and learned that Rodney was a quiet, reserved person who kept to himself and did not arouse any suspicion. To gather more information, Bill went to the home of Rodney Dank, 40, who lived with his mother near Amy's family. Rodney worked at an auto parts store and had been divorced for some time, with an adult son whom he rarely saw. When Bill arrived at Rodney's home, his mother answered and told the police that Rodney was at work. Bill left his business card, asking Rodney to call him as soon as he returned. Rodney called Bill that evening and the police asked to meet with him to discuss Amy's murder. Rodney agreed and allowed Bill to come to his home. However, when Bill returned to Rodney's home, he was not there. Bill decided to run a background check on Rodney and discovered that Rodney had been convicted of assault in 1991 and burglary in 1997. The police also compared Rodney's fingerprints, which were already in the system, to the fingerprints found at Amy's house during the initial investigation. The test was conducted to determine if Rodney was involved in the case. When the results came back, they discovered that Rodney's fingerprints matched the bloody fingerprints found at the crime scene. After 23 years, Rodney was identified as the killer, but he had disappeared from the house. The police launched an extensive search. They tracked Rodney's credit card activity, which showed a rental car with an OnStar tracking system. The police located the car in Indianapolis, where Rodney was hiding at a friend's house. When surrounded by police, Rodney brandished a knife and claimed his innocence, injuring himself. He attempted to attack the police but was subdued with a taser, handcuffed, and taken to hospital. During a 2-day hospital interrogation that was captured on camera, Rodney confessed to Amy's murder. He said his original intention was to rob, not anticipating Amy's presence due to her illness. Rodney described entering the house through a sliding glass door, where he was suddenly confronted by a panicked Amy. In his panic, he grabbed the nearest object and hit Amy in the head, killing her. As he recounted the events of the next 2 days, Rodney repeatedly mentioned that his memory of the incident was hazy, blaming the 23 years that had passed since the crime. Rodney's account of his actions was inconsistent, and he initially mentioned visiting Amy's house with someone called Bag. However, he could not recall many details about this person, including their appearance. When asked about Emily, Rodney stated that he did not see her during the incident and did not know that she was in the house or that she had called for help. Throughout the interrogation, Rodney remained calm. Rodney's DNA was collected and matched with semen found on Amy's bedsheets and blankets in 1989. Fingerprints and semen found at the crime scene were both confirmed to be Rodney's, with no indication that anyone else was involved. When Rodney was revealed as the killer, Amy's family was shocked. They were baffled how Rodney, who was quiet and unassuming, could have committed such a crime. Rodney was friends with Amy's brother John Paul and often visited their home, which was across the street from his. Even more remarkable was that Rodney attended Amy's funeral, where he mourned her death and offered his condolences to her mother, Gloria. Police Bill later found Rodney's signature in Amy's funeral book, a detail that had previously been overlooked. Reinvestigating the case led Bill to a crucial discovery. Rodney's name was first mentioned by Tony, Amy's ex-boyfriend and Emily's biological father, in 2003. Tony revealed that Rodney had frequently visited Amy's family home. Bill realized that Rodney had somehow escaped notice in 1989 and had never been suspected or questioned at the time. Further investigation into Rodney's background in 2012 uncovered a disturbing fact. His biological son, Dylan, was in prison for a crime committed in 2009. Dylan was 16 when he killed his biological mother, Mary McHenry. He claimed that he had acted in response to her abuse, using a baseball bat to inflict the fatal wounds. Mary died of her injuries. Dylan turned 17 just days after the incident, leaving behind a tragic and heartbreaking case. Despite being largely absent from Dylan's life due to his early divorce from Mary McHenry, Rodney attended Dylan's trial in 2009, opting for a plea deal that resulted in a 20-year prison sentence. By the time of his scheduled release in 2029, Dylan will be 37. Rodney, on the other hand, initially insisted that he had an accomplice in Amy's murder, a man he knew as Bag. However, in June 2013, just 10 days before his trial was due to begin, Rodney, then 42, recanted his earlier confession, admitting that he had acted alone in Amy's murder. Rodney's sudden confession, combined with the substantial evidence against him, led to his 65-year prison sentence in 2013. Amy's family held a meeting with Detective Bill Carter after Amy's case was solved. To mark the 24th anniversary of her death, they released 24 balloons into the air, expressing their gratitude for Detective Bill's crucial role in solving the case. The family thanked him for his efforts, especially for identifying Rodney as the killer after just 12 days of investigation. Police officer Bill Carter received a prestigious award from the Indianapolis Police Department in January 2014. Although he was offered a position in the Homicide Bureau, he chose to stay in his current position. Years later, Amy's daughter, Emily, has grown up. She graduated from her mother's alma mater and then went to college, looking for new opportunities. Eventually, Emily moved from Indianapolis to California. Gloria still lives in the house where her daughter, Amy, tragically died. She has kept Amy's room as a memory of her, with photos still on display. Now, the room is also where Gloria's grandchildren play when they visit for the holidays, bringing joy and new life to a space once filled with sadness and loss.